Hey friends, before we dive into tonight's story, did you know that nearly 80% of the people who watch these videos aren't subscribed? If you're enjoying this kind of content, consider hitting the subscribe button. It really helps a lot, and it keeps these long stories going. Also, I'd love to hear from you. What time is it right now where you are, and which city are you listening from tonight? And if these stories help you sleep, feel free to tap the thanks button to support the channel. It truly means a lot. All right, let's get into it. I slid out of the precinct garage at exactly 22:07, the chill night air seeping through the crack between door and window as I eased my cruiser onto Elm Street. The dashboard clock glowed orange, and I'd already downed 4 cups of stale coffee by then. Black, no sugar. The only thing keeping my mind from drifting off as I settled into the graveyard shift. Tonight promised that same familiar rhythm. Eat the coffee, drive the empty roads, answer the radio, feel the weight of the dark pressing in from all sides. My first run came 7 minutes in. Signal 25, possible DUI, Honda Civic, license plate hit fentanyl. I killed my headlights just before the narrow turnout on County Line Road, letting the glow of the Civic's broken brake lamp guide me. That red flicker looked weak, like the last gasp of a dying cigarette. Pulling up yards behind, I cut the engine and cracked my door. The damp grass hissed under my boots as I approached. The driver sat slumped over the wheel, shoulders trembling, one arm dangling out the window. Steam rose from the hood like a ghost drifting off the radiator. "Sir?" I called softly. His head lolled, and he blinked, pupils blown wide. He muttered, "Just a ride, officer," words slurred as if his tongue had been dipped in syrup. I caught the scent of acetone and something sweeter, fentanyl, no doubt. I clicked on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the fog. No one waiting for him on these back roads. Abandoned fields stretching both ways. He'd clearly passed out chasing a high. I knelt by the open window, offered him water from my cup holder. His hand hovered, trembling, before it dropped back to the wheel. I reached in, nudging the ignition off. The engine's rumble died, leaving only the drone of crickets and the faint click-click of distant train tracks. I radioed in for EMS, keeping one hand on the car's frame. He mumbled again, drool pooling at the corner of his mouth. His head lolled back, eyes rolling upward, and I caught myself flinching, a bad habit. My grip on the flashlight tightened. 10 minutes later, the ambulance arrived, its lights flashing pale blue against the cornfield. I stood back as the paramedic slid a pulse oximeter onto the driver's finger. His fingers were ice, lips gray. They loaded him onto the stretcher, strapping arms and legs with Velcro bands. I watched them ease him into the gurney, praying his heart would steady. Then they lifted him into the back, doors slamming shut. The yellow folding gurney rattled inside, and the ambulance peeled away, siren muted by distance. I rubbed my eyes, turned back to the cruiser, and noticed the sky beginning to blur at the horizon, gray smudges edging into black. I shook off the chill that seeped into my bones and tapped the mic. "Unit clear, back in service." My voice sounded too loud in the quiet. By 23:12, I was back on patrol through the industrial park. Streetlights hung over empty warehouses, flickering like tired eyes. Signal 38, welfare check requested. Silent house at 564 Maple Drive. I recognized that address. A small white farmhouse last tagged for neglect. The porch light was out, and the front door hung open by a single hinge. I parked on the gravel, radio off, stepping onto the veranda where the wood slats creaked underfoot. The front window was dark, the heavy drapes drawn. Inside, everything looked untouched. A toddler's rain boots lined up by the door, 2 chipped mugs on the sink, a calendar marked with yesterday's date. I called out, "Mrs. Delgado, it's the sheriff's office." Silence swallowed my voice. I lifted my flashlight, the beam dancing across the living room, sofa covered in Afghans, a coffee table stacked with Sunday papers. On the wall hung a framed wedding photo, faces smiling in the golden light of a May afternoon. I felt my pulse quicken. Domestic welfare checks always carried that bite, the fear of finding a crime scene, a family torn apart. Then came the sound. A slow scrape from above, like dragging a heavy bag across a wooden floor. My breath hitched. I ducked under the lintel, climbing the stairs 2 at a time. The air tightened around me, heavy with dust and old secrets. At the top, the attic hatch lay open, hinges rusted. A man sat perched on the edge, legs dangling, his skin chalk white, eyes wide. He clutched a faded photograph, the same wedding portrait I'd seen downstairs. I leveled my flashlight. "Sir, come down slowly." His shoulders shook. He whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Tears glinted in the beam, cutting through the darkness like shards. I guided him down, hand on his elbow, every step echoing in the empty house. The wife emerged from a hallway, eyes rimmed red, hair loose around her shoulders. She wrapped her arms around him. I stayed back, feeling the hush settle like dust. I radioed dispatch for Adult Protective Services and turned back toward the door with the weight of someone else's nightmare pressing on my spine. At 0029, the neon sign of a closed gas station blinked, "Open 24 hours," though the pumps were locked. Signal 45, suspicious vehicle, tan Nissan Pathfinder. I cut across the lot, tires crunching on fragments of glass and plastic. The Pathfinder sat angled toward the road, windows tinted dark. Inside, scattered fast food wrappers, a blunt half-smoked in the console and blood on the passenger seat. I pressed my chest against the door, peered through the tint. No one in sight, but the crimson smear looked fresh, bright enough to burn your eyes. My hand fell to the holster, fingers curling around the flashlight instead of the weapon. I eased the door open, wincing as the glass scraped. The heat of the asphalt rose up through my boots, even at this hour. I crouched, sweeping the interior. The blood dripped off the edge of the seat, pooling on the floor mat. I radioed for backup, heart hammering in my ears. 5 minutes stretched into eternity. When the partner car finally pulled up, I backed away slowly. 2 officers jumped out, weapons drawn, and swept through the passenger side while I covered the driver's door. The beam of their flashlights cut through leather and metal, dancing over the console. No one emerged. No suspect, no witness. Only that pool of blood, shining under the glow of emergency lights. We scoured the lot, then the empty storefronts across the street, but came up empty. By 1:03, I was back behind the wheel, hands trembling on the steering wheel, replaying every drop of red. I tuned the radio back to the weather report. Nothing but wind forecasts and traffic updates. I shut it off again, the silence reclaiming every echo of my heartbeat. At 2:17, the call came through. Signal 11, domestic disturbance, possible injured child. The address was a duplex on Oak Street, blue siding peeling, curtains flapping like ghosts in the broken windows. I found a couple arguing on the porch. He wore a bloodstain on his sleeve. She wore scratches down her arm. They pointed to the back room where I found a toddler huddled under a quilt, eyes glassy with tears. No cuts, but tremors shook his tiny frame. I knelt beside the crib, whispering assurances until the paramedics arrived. The parents were double-locked in the kitchen, yelling apologies and threats. I guided them both down to cuffs. his arms crossed over her shoulders like a vice. I told them social services was en route, watched as they transformed from furious adults into frightened souls standing on a porch in the night. At 3:41, I drove by the old motel on the highway's edge, its neon Pearl Inn sign sputtering, flickering fortunes in magenta. The dispatch called, "Unresponsive person in parking lot." I found her slumped behind a Buick Roadmaster, hair splayed across the trunk, one arm dangling. No pulse, no breath. I knelt, pressed 2 fingers to her neck, gone. Cold settled in my chest. I rolled her gently onto her back. The dew-soaked pavement seeped through her shirt. I radioed the coroner, tried to keep the tremor out of my voice. The motel's neon buzzed overhead, casting her skin in bruised purples. I stayed until they came, watching the sheet go over her head like a winter blanket, and felt her story vanish with that final fold. By 4:56, the sky was turning gray in the east. I navigated the narrow lanes back toward town, gravel crunching under tires. The weight of the night pressed down, each call folded into the next, stories bleeding together in my memory. I rolled the cruiser into the lot at 5:07. The radio silent now, the coffee long gone cold in the cup holder. I sat there in the cab, radio off, breathing shallow. No one had shot at me. No chase had torn through the dark. But every routine stop had left a scar. The fentanyl drifting through that Honda, the old man in the attic, the blood staining the Pathfinder, the crying child, the silent body behind the Buick. I touched my face, feeling the rough stubble of an unshaven night, and wondered how many times I'd answer yes when someone asked me if I was okay. Then I drove inside, boots dragging on the tiled floor, wondering if I'd ever unsee what clung to my eyes, if I'd ever stop chasing ghosts down these gravel roads. I pushed through the front doors of the precinct at 5:09, fluorescent lights humming overhead as I climbed the narrow stairwell to my desk. The corridor smelled of bleach and paper, the familiar staleness of reports waiting to be filed. I dropped my keys onto the wood laminate, radio still dead in my pocket, and peeled off my jacket. My uniform shirt clung damp to my skin from the night's chill. I hung it on the hook marked Sergeant Harris, careful not to jostle the laminated schedule pinned above it. I sat at the desk, unfolded my laptop, and stared at the blank incident report form. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat. Every call from the past 8 hours hovered in the space between reality and nightmare, each detail too sharp to ignore. The glaze in that driver's eyes, the addict's hush, the letter of blood on torn vinyl, the toddler's trembling sigh, the teenager's still body in neon light. I opened a new document and typed, 22:14 hours, DUI fentanyl overdose on County Line Road. My fingers hovered. I realized I could never write all of it down. Couldn't capture the weight of that man's chest rising and falling under my flashlight beam, the dread lodging in my throat as the paramedics slid him onto the stretcher. I closed the document. By 6:02 I'd filled out the bare minimum, times, addresses, dispositions, then pushed back from the desk. I had 30 minutes of light duty before roll call, and I needed air. I grabbed my coat again, the fabric stiff and cold, and headed for the back door. Outside, dawn was breathing soft pink across the horizon. The parking lot was empty except for one patrol SUV, its lights off, engine idling in the chill. I approached, hood of my coat pulled low. I let my breath plume in front of me and ran my gloved hand over the roof of the vehicle. Felt the grit of frost and dust under my fingertips. I sat on the tailgate, feet dangling, and rested my elbows on my knees. The world was quiet, almost too quiet. No radio crackles, no sirens, no distant shouts, only the sound of my own heart pulse hammering in my ears, reminding me that out there, the dark still held secrets I wasn't ready to leave behind. I closed my eyes, and flashes of the night's calls flickered behind my lids. The driver's doll-like eyes, the attic's black stain, that smear of blood so bright it burned, the toddler's blanket, the stillness behind the Buick. I swallowed against the lump in my throat, pressed my palms into my eyes, and counted down from 10 to calm the tremor. At 6:37, the precinct PA crackled through the lot. "All personnel, please report to briefing room." I rose, lungs tightening, and slid off the tailgate. My boots hit the pavement, hard and final. I walked toward the building, shoulders squared, mask in place. Step by step, I forced my mind back into procedure. Inside the briefing room, 10 officers sat around the rectangular table, coffee cups steaming, gloves strewn. The watch commander, a tall lieutenant with silver in his hair, stood at the whiteboard. Behind him, photos from the night were pinned to the bulletin: a broken brake lamp, a farmhouse porch in darkness, a trail of blood drops, a tiny sneaker under a crib, and the Buick's rear bumper. Names scratched beneath each: fentanyl OD, welfare check, suspicious vehicle, domestic disturbance, unresponsive female. He cleared his throat. "Morning, everyone. Let's debrief. Sergeant Harris, you first." My voice felt thick as I stood and walked to the board. I pointed at the civic photo. 50-year-old male, OD on fentanyl. Paramedics report stable after IV naloxone. No arrests, tags on file. I moved to the farmhouse. Welfare check, elderly male with dementia. Family contacted APS, no charges, but will follow up. At the pawnshop lot, I hesitated. Blood in passenger seat, no suspect. Car towed as evidence. Ballistics to test whether it matches any outstanding offenses. I pushed past the lump in my throat. Domestic disturbance, minor injuries, social services involved, child unharmed. Finally, I pointed to the motel. Female, approximate age 18, declared deceased on arrival. Coroner's report pending. He nodded, all questions procedural, no emotion. I sat back down, heart still racing. The lieutenant moved on to property releases and staffing changes, but I wasn't listening. My mind kept drifting to that teenager under the Buick's neon glow. I'd seen people die before: heart attacks, overdoses, accidents. But this was someone's child, alone on wet asphalt, waiting for a sheet. The thought clawed at me darker than any 2 a.m. fog. By 7:15, briefing ended. I collected my jacket and walked to the locker room. The hallway lights buzzed, a fluorescent lament. I swapped my uniform for plain clothes, gray slacks, blue button-down, tie loose at the collar. I packed my duty belt, radio clipped on, taser, flashlight, spare magazine. I touched the holster, cold metal reassuring against my thigh. In the hallway mirror, I examined my reflection. Pale skin, dark circles, stubble shadow. The eyes looked hollow, too old for a man of 37. I straightened my tie one last time and stepped out onto the breakfast break room. The vending machines glowed. Soda cans and protein bars waiting behind glass. I pressed the button for a granola bar, coins clinking. As the bar slid down, I watched its wrapper rattle against the plastic shelf, thinking how fragile we all were, glass bottles waiting to break inside. I tore the wrapper, unwrapped the bar, and took a bite. The crumbs fell onto the table. I chewed mechanically, tasting only grit and exhaustion. Around me, other officers chatted about last night's football game, weekend plans, nothing about blood or dying children. I swallowed and forced out a laugh at someone's joke. At precisely 7:45, I locked the break room door and headed for my car. The city was waking, garbage trucks rattling down the street, early joggers puffing along sidewalks, neon signs flickering off. I slid into the driver's seat, granola bar wrappers on the floor, uniform jacket folded in the back. I started the engine and sat for a moment, headlights washing over the cracked pavement. I drove off, thinking about paperwork, follow-ups, the morning shift taking over. But above the hum of the engine, the night reverberated. The echo of a heartbeat in that motel lot, the attic silence, the blood's drip, the toddler's tears. I wondered how many more nights I'd carry that weight before it broke me. And somewhere, in the depths of my mind, I knew the real darkness wasn't out there at 3 a.m. It was the emptiness that followed when the lights came on. I eased out of the station lot just before 8 a.m., the sun fully up now, casting long shadows across the pavement as I steered my cruiser onto the arterial road. My uniform hung neatly in the back seat, no reason to keep it wrinkled, and I wore plain clothes under the light, jacket, blending into the early morning commuter traffic. The radio crackled to life with dispatch updates I barely registered. Routine fender benders, stray dogs in traffic, alarm panels tripping in empty offices. All the usual noise that fills your ears after the night's real calls have stopped echoing in your mind. I punched in the GPS coordinates for the first follow-up of the day, the pawn shop lot where we'd found that pool of blood in the Pathfinder. I wanted to see if evidence techs had secured the vehicle, and maybe catch a glimpse of the ballistics report posted on the detective's board. As I drove, my eyes kept drifting to the rearview mirror. Did I still look like the man who'd sat on that tailgate watching dawn creep across the lot? The stubble on my face itched, and the ache under my ribs from leaning over that kid's body behind the Buick hadn't faded. The pawn shop was a squat brick building with boarded-up windows now, the "We Buy Gold" neon forever dark. The tow truck was still acting as a barricade in the front lot. Heavy chains draped over the Pathfinder's axles. I parked a few yards away and stepped out, boots crunching on gravel. Evidence tape fluttered like a half-remembered warning. Yellow ribbons snapped against the car's doors. I ducked under and made my way around to the driver's side, scanning the scene. A detective stood beside the car, leather jacket unzipped, hands in pockets. He looked up as I approached. "Morning, Harris," he said without enthusiasm. Ballistics came back. Blood on the seat matches the DNA from that missing person report downtown. We're looking at a homicide victim, not just a simple assault. I swallowed. So, the kid in the Buick and this could be related. The detective shrugged. "Maybe. We're cross-referencing phone records. I'll let you know." He tapped his pen against his palm and walked off, leaving me alone with the hush of the morning. I circled the car, noting every detail anew. The way the blood had been wiped in one spot, leaving a smear that looked like a brushstroke. The crack in the windshield ran diagonal, cutting the world in two, and maybe, I thought, cutting that kid's life in half too. A gust of wind rattled the empty storefronts across the street, sending a tumbleweed skittering across cracked pavement. I stepped back, ducked under the tape, and climbed into the cruiser. The engine fired, and I idled a moment before pulling away, heart pounding as though I'd just raced stop war. The detective's words wrapped around me. Homicide, missing persons, blood-spattered seats, and I pressed both hands against the steering wheel to steady my breath. My next stop was the family home on Maple Drive. Social services had arranged a follow-up for the elderly man with dementia. I wanted to check on him, make sure he was safely in a care facility. I found the house humming with life. A social worker's van in the driveway and paramedics helping him into an ambulance for the short trip to the memory care unit. His daughter hugged him, tears in her eyes, as he reached for her hand and asked again, "Are we safe now?" He looked up at me, bewildered. "Officer, do I have to go to jail?" I knelt and took his free hand. "No, sir, just some new friends to help you remember the good days." He nodded uncertainly, and as the van pulled away, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Back in the cruiser, I thought about that attic, how fragile the mind could be, how memory and reality twist together until you don't know which is which. I sipped lukewarm coffee from my travel mug, hoping for at least one solid reason to feel useful today. At 9:45, the radio barked. "Signal 32, hit and run, victim transported to County General." The location was a stretch of two-lane blacktop lined with oaks whose leaves had turned gold. I had responded earlier in the night to a drunk driver. Now it sounded like someone else had crashed into the guardrail where I'd parked and left debris scattered across the shoulder. Spine tight, I turned onto that road. When I arrived, paramedics were wheeling the victim, a young woman, in through the ER doors. I ducked under the yellow tape, approached the guardrail. It was twisted inward, metal curled like paper. Tire tracks gouged the asphalt, leading into a ditch where a faded red Civic lay half buried. The driver was gone. I knelt by the wreck, ran my gloved fingers over the crumpled hood. There was no blood, no sign of a body, just the crackle of leaves underfoot and the hush of morning traffic thinning behind me. I radioed dispatch. Vehicle abandoned. Possible hit-and-run victim still in County General. Request bolo on a red Civic. Driver possibly injured and walking. The radio crackled back confirmation. I made a mental note. Another trauma etched into the asphalt. Another person whose world fractured in an instant. The detective from earlier arrived, clipboard in hand. "We'll tow it. Let's get fingerprint techs. Out here." He studied the wreck. "Looks like it spun out, hit the rail, then she fled." I nodded, heart sinking with the realization that fear drives people to do unthinkable things, like abandoning a crash and disappearing into the woods. I watched as techs dusted for prints, and I wondered if that woman would recall who hit her, or if she, too, would wake up in a hospital bed with nothing but fragmented memories of a dark road. I pulled out my notebook, jotted down times and descriptions, not daring to let myself feel too much. By 11:03, I was back on the highway heading toward the precinct. The cruiser hummed, music playing softly on the radio. I rifled through messages on the squad email, evidence updates, missing person notifications, scheduling changes. Everything felt pedestrian, bureaucratic. But beneath it all, the night's events pulsed like an open wound. I pulled into the parking garage, lights flickering as I turned off the engine. I sat for a moment, chest tight, replaying the panic in that woman's eyes, the twisted metal's silent scream, the detective's grim expression at the pawn shop. I allowed myself a single deep breath before stepping out, slamming the door shut. In the stairwell, I paused on the landing, listening to distant voices. Dispatchers, officers on the radio, the clatter of keyboards. The station was waking up, day shift mounting its own watch. I straightened my posture, smoothed my shirt, and marched up the stairs, determined to hand off the log and move on. But as I reached the top step, I felt it again. The uncanny quiet of Elm Road at 2 a.m., the attic's hush, the motel neon, the child's soft cries. It followed me like a shadow, clinging to my boots. I exhaled, muscles loosening. The weight would still be there tomorrow, and the next night, and the night after that. But for now, I pushed it aside and stepped into the fluorescent glare. Another day beginning. Another shift ending. And even as I walked through the station doors, I knew I would carry those echoes into my dreams, where the darkness never quite lifts. The mid-morning sun slanted through the cracked windshield as I steered toward the old quarry road, tracers of light dancing off scattered rocks like warning beacons. My coffee had long gone cold. and every mile marker I passed felt like another layer of tension settling into my shoulders. At 12:17, dispatch pinged a follow-up on the hit-and-run investigation. Victim ID confirmed. Jane Morales, 24. Last seen leaving work at 11 p.m. I ran the name through the console, heart tightening when her file window popped up. Address 2 towns over, no known relatives in the county, a rental unit near the river. I arrived at her apartment complex. Peeling paint on the doors, a single chain-link fence separating the parking area from a muddy creek below. I parked by the curb and approached the entryway, tapping on the glass of apartment 3B. The door cracked open a sliver, and a neighbor peeked out. "Officer," she whispered. I didn't know she worked late. I thought she was home safe. I showed my badge, asked for permission to enter. Inside, half-packed boxes lined the hallway. She'd been planning to move back to her hometown next month. Her bedroom was deserted, her bed neatly made, phone charger still plugged in by the nightstand. I flicked on a small lamp. Dust motes hung in the beam. No sign of a struggle. I stepped outside onto the balcony. The railing wobbed under my hand, and below, the creek gurgled over stones. My radio crackled. Unit 52, Evidence Tech, has photos from the scene at County Line Road, possible tire tread marks on the victim's skirt. I blinked against the bright light, remembering the crushed denim and the way her fingers had gone slack beneath the sheet. 2 investigations. 2 halves of a puzzle I was still scrambling to piece together. By 13:02, I had coordinates for the tow yard where the battered red Civic was stored. I found it chained behind a row of impounded vehicles, dust and pollen coating its hood. I circled it, flashlight in hand, noting parallel scratches on the passenger door, like nails raking metal. Inside, the back seat held a single earring, a small hoop with a heart-shaped charm. I slipped it into an evidence bag and sealed it, heart pounding. On my way back, I radioed the detective. "We've got a potential link. Victim's jewelry found in the hit-and-run car." No reply. He was probably buried under paperwork. At 14:27, I responded to a call from County General. Patient Morales was awake but confused, no memory of the crash. I stood outside the ICU cubicle as a nurse adjusted her IV. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked at me with suspicion. "Officer, did you find him?" she asked hoarsely. "Find who?" I swallowed. "Anyone who hit me?" She shook her head, gaze drifting to the window. Just darkness, then white. I jotted notes as she spoke, every word another thread weaving into the night's tapestry of dread. By 15:45, I reached the riverbank, where Morales had been dropped off by ambulance. Muddy water lapped against concrete barriers. Crows wheeled overhead. I shone my flashlight along the edge, feet sinking into wet gravel. Half buried in silt, I found a piece of shattered mirror, smeared with a dark smudge. I pocketed it, knowing it might hold a fingerprint. Driving home at 17:01, I replayed her words. The darkness, the flash of headlights, the sickening crunch. I felt the same weight I'd carried through every call, pressing at my temples. The knowledge that routine can unravel people's lives in an instant, leaving nothing but shadows and questions. When I finally pulled into the driveway at 6:20 p.m., I stood in the glow of my porch light, hand on the doorknob. Inside, the silence of my house greeted me, the ticking of a wall clock, the hum of the refrigerator. I flicked on a lamp and set my keys on the table, mind still on the quarry road, the bloody passenger seat, the attic photo, the motel lot, and now Jane Morales, each echo a ghost I couldn't lay to rest. I exhaled, shoulders sagging, and as I crossed the threshold, I saw it again. The cracked mirror fragment, catching lamplight on the entryway table. Darkness trapped in a shard. A quiet, devastating realization settled over me. In the grind of every routine shift, I'd become both keeper of nightmares and prisoner of my own memories, unable to escape them, no matter how brightly the day might shine. I woke to the shrill of my alarm at 19:45 the next evening, every muscle aching from the day's paperwork, and the hollow ache in my chest that wouldn't let me rest. I sat up in the dark, blinking against the glow of the clock. 19:45. The sun had long since set, leaving only the dull luminescence of streetlights through my curtains. I reached for the mug on my nightstand, 2/3 full of cold coffee, and drained the bitter dregs before swinging my legs over the side of the bed. By 2012, I was back behind the wheel of the cruiser, the engine's growl cutting through the suburban calm as I cruised toward County Line Road. The detective's voicemail pinged earlier. "Harris, check your email. Possible match on trace evidence from that mirror shard." My stomach clenched. I tapped the radio mic, no calls yet, and merged onto the highway, headlights slicing through the mist clinging to the pavement. The radar chirped at 2037 on the outskirts. Signal 61, reckless, driving westbound. I flicked on the lights and caught sight of a sedan weaving between lanes, taillights jerking. I fell in behind, engine idling close enough to read the illuminated license plate. I dialed it into the console. No hits, but the owner's address was 2 blocks away. The car crossed over the fog line, hugging the curb. I tapped the siren briefly and motioned it to pull over. The driver stayed hunched low, waiting until the cruiser's blue light painted his rear bumper. When I approached, I saw his hands tremble on the wheel. He was young, maybe 22, eyes darting like panicked birds. "Evening, sir. License and registration, please." His voice cracked as he fumbled for his wallet, handing me a learner's permit with a photo that didn't match the face aglow in the blue light. His knuckles were stained yellow with nicotine, and the faint scent of whiskey clung to his jacket. "Sir, this isn't yours," I said softly, holding the permit at arm's length. He swallowed. I found it," he stammered. My flashlight beam drifted to the passenger floorboard, a crumpled sandwich wrapper stamped with a diner logo, half washed away by rain. And there, tucked beneath the seat, a single hoop earring, identical to the one we'd bagged from the Civic. My pulse spiked. Before I could radio it in, his foot slammed the accelerator, and we lurched forward, bumper to bumper, spinning tires spraying mist across the road. I slammed on the brakes, cursed under my breath, and leapt in front of his door, hand on the Glock in its retention holster. The sedan screeched to a halt. The driver's door flew open. He bolted into the night, legs pumping, breath ripping in ragged gasps. I sprinted after him across a sodden field, flashlight beam bouncing erratically over the dew-laced grass. He crashed through a stand of saplings, branches snapping across his back, and vanished into the shadows along the embankment. I paused at the tree line, chest heaving, listening. Only the drone of distant traffic and my own ragged breathing. I radioed for backup. Suspect fled eastbound into the woods, possible involvement in hit and run and false ID. My voice was flat, controlled, but my hands shook as I holstered my weapon. Footsteps approached. My partner, Breen, came up on my left, flashlight cutting through the dark. "What did you set off?" he asked, voice low. I pointed to the field. "That kid's got Morales' earring." Then he took off. Breen clicked on his radio. "Let's get eyes on this place. We'll grid search." We fanned out, moving in silent triangles, beneath towering oaks whose branches dripped with moisture. Each beam of light revealed only empty air and hoof prints half erased by the night's dew. My mind raced, stolen earring, reckless flight, the case thread pulling tighter. I hated manhunts. They strip everything bare until all that's left is fear. At 21:18, Breen's shout broke the stillness. "Over here!" He stood beside the creek's edge, kneeling near a clump of mud. Knees pressed into the wet earth, he pulled free a small brass hoop, bent and scratched. "This your lucky day," he said quietly. I held it up, heart thumping against my ribs like an alarm bell. Matches the dip mold from the shard. I slipped it into my evidence bag, breath gusting in my chest. We stayed until 21:47, canvassing the shoreline, scanning for footprints or broken branches. No sign of the driver. I called in the find, requested K9 units for the morning. They'd have sharper noses for tracking. By the time I climbed back into the cruiser, the night felt colder, emptier, the weight of the chase settling in my gut like an anchor. At 22:05, I decided to circle back to the motel lot where the teenager's body had been found. The neon sign still flickered, Pearl Inn, but the parking lot was abandoned, empty as a grave. I parked under the sign, engine idling, and stepped out. The air smelled of mildew and rust. My breath plumed in the beam of my flashlight. I walked to the spot where the body had lain, reading the faint disturbance in the gravel. Kneeling, I ran a gloved finger over the ground. Nothing new, but I noticed a single boot print stamped in mud that hadn't been there before. I took a photo, careful to frame it against the cracked concrete, then stood and shone my light across the lot. Beyond the curb, streetlights cast long shadows through the chain-link fence. No movement, just that hush again, the hunger of darkness pressing against the edges of my senses. I climbed back in and closed the door, the click echoing too loud. My reflection blurred in the window, eyes rimmed red, face gaunt, uniform unshaken by the wind. I killed the engine and let silence fill the cab. Somewhere behind me, a stray cat yowled, a mournful cry swallowed by impenetrable black. I tapped the mic one last time. Unit, standing by at Pearl Inn, awaiting K9. My voice trembled, carrying the weight of every routine call turned nightmare. The radio crackled back, indistinct. I swept my flashlight over the empty lot one more time before setting it in the holder. Then I leaned my head back against the seat, eyes closed, and felt the darkness settle in around me. I felt the cruiser's engine purr beneath me as I leaned back in the seat, flashlight slipping from my grip and clattering to the floor. The K9 unit hadn't arrived yet, and the motel lot was silent. Only the sputter of the neon sign overhead, buzzing like an unsteady heartbeat. Outside, the chain-link fence trembled under a breeze I couldn't feel, and the shattered glass in the gravel glinted under the spotlight like broken stars. My chest heaved, ribs pressing into the steering wheel, and my fingers itched around the gear shift, desperate to move again, to chase down every echo the night had left behind. My radio crackled. Unit 52, K9 on scene. Handler and Bravo approaching from north entrance. ETA 2 minutes. I sat up straighter, rubbing the hollow ache in my side. 2 minutes could feel like an eternity when someone you needed was missing. I reached for the door handle, swung it open, and stepped onto the damp asphalt. My boots sank slightly into the dew-soaked gravel. The dog's bay, low, urgent, broke the hush, and I turned toward the motel entrance where a tall officer was unbuckling a German Shepherd from the back of a Ford SUV. "Detect," I said, voice grating on my own nerves. "We got a print in the mud, the blood earring." I held up a gloved hand. The handler nodded, leash in hand. The hound's nose was already to the ground, nostrils flaring as it pressed along the lot's edge, sniffing every crack in the concrete. I watched its back rise and fall, the way its tail flicked like a metronome, keeping time with the tension in my gut. The dog led us around the corner of the building, slipping under a chain-link gate that hung off kilter. I followed, careful not to trip on discarded beer bottles or broken flip-flops. The yard behind the motel was overgrown, tall grass waving like a warning flag in the night breeze. We moved in a loose line. Handler, dog, me, and the detective bringing up the rear with a flashlight and a notebook. The shepherd paused at a narrow path beaten through thickets of blackberry brambles. Sharp thorns snagged my sleeves as I pushed through. I could see the long highway lights beyond. The road I patrolled just hours before now, so far away it felt like another world. The dog sniffed higher, heading toward the ditch where the embankment sloped down to a dry creek bed. Under the beam of my flashlight, I saw footprints pressed into soft mud, one set of rough-soled boots, toes pointed downhill. I knelt, traced the indentation with a fingertip. The detective took photographs and labeled the print in his notebook. The dog's ears perked. It strained on the leash, pulling us forward. I rose, brushing blackberry scratches from my forearms. The path narrowed until we were beneath a low overpass, graffiti smeared across concrete pillars. Names, symbols, a half-legible phrase. Run away. The shepherd pressed its nose against a damp patch at the base of the pillar, tail wagging stiffly. Handler crouched, ran a scanner across the concrete. Residue of motor oil mixed with something darker. I flicked on my phone's light and knelt to pick at the spot. A small smear of rust-colored liquid, crusted into the concrete. Blood. I tucked a swab into an evidence tube. We followed the tracks further down, the embankment curving like a hidden amphitheater beneath the highway. The dog's bay resonated against the pillars. My heart pounded in my ears. Somewhere up ahead, the suspect was breathing, thinking, perhaps watching us. The path spat us into a clearing where a broken shopping cart lay on its side, wheels bent, a shredded blanket hanging from the handle. I stepped forward, careful. The detective caught up, shining his light into the cart. Inside, a black backpack, unzipped and splayed open. Clothes, a half-empty bottle of water, a crumpled pack of cigarettes stamped with a health warning. He leaned in and carefully peeled back the lining. A wad of cash, folded bills stained with something dark. My stomach turned. The wind tossed the loose blanket and I caught a glimpse of movement beyond the trees. A figure darting between pillars, hood up, face hidden. I raised my taser, fingers tense on the holster, voice low. Stop. County Sheriff's Office. The wind snatched the words away. The figure paused, outline rigid. Then they bolted toward the creek bed. I took off running, feet slapping rocks and mud. The dog barked, Handler close behind, and we chased the shape through a labyrinth of undergrowth. I could hear my own breath, sharp as a vice, and the thump of boots in my right ear. The suspect slipped, cursed, and the dog closed the gap. Breath hot, teeth bared. I holstered the taser and moved in, hand on the suspect's shoulder, pulling them to a stop. "Get on the ground," I yelled. The figure rolled, palms pressed into mud. I recognized him, the reckless driver from earlier, eyes wide, hoodie plastered to his forehead with sweat. He coughed, voice raspy. "You don't understand," he spat. His t-shirt rode up, and I saw the faint bruises and cuts, maybe from the bramble chase. His face glistened under my flashlight. "Why?" I asked, cuffing his wrists. "Why leave her to die? Why steal her life?" His head dropped. The detective knelt, shining a light on his face. "You hit her," I said. "Then you took the earring. You tried to vanish." The suspect's shoulders slumped. He looked up, eyes red. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. She screamed. God, she screamed. But I couldn't help her. His voice cracked. We led him back through the clearing, the cart and backpack behind us like broken witness. The dog padded quietly, nose to the ground. By the time we reached the lot, the neon sign was flickering its last message before dawn. Check in. We loaded the suspect into the back of the cruiser, and I sat in the front seat, turning off my body camera. The recorder clicked, but the light stayed red, evidence that I'd be telling this story again in a courtroom. Driving back toward the station, I watched the horizon lighten. My jacket, stained with sweat and smudged with mud, lay across the passenger seat. I unbuckled my seatbelt, pulled the collar tight against the morning chill. The quiet inside the car felt heavy, like the calm after a storm that never fully passed. I turned onto the main road, heart still hammering. The suspect's confession echoed in my mind. The panic, the regret, the scream he said he heard but didn't stop for. I flicked the wipers, clearing dew from the windshield. In the mirror, I caught a glimpse of my own eyes, bloodshot and ringed with fatigue. I realized the shift hadn't ended until I'd closed the door on the last call, and here I was, still carrying it. At 4 a.m., I parked back at the station and walked the suspect inside. Inside the briefing room, the watch commander was balancing coffee and case files. He glanced up. "Late night," he said. I nodded, keys jostling in my hand. "Longer than usual." He followed me as I booked the suspect. Every fingerprint, every cuff mark, every statement typed into the system felt brittle, like glass shards. When I finished, I looked up at the fluorescent lights, humming overhead, the same relentless glare that met me when I walked in the first time. I expelled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. "Detective," I said softly. "I'm heading home." He hesitated. "You good?" I shrugged off my duty belt and draped it over the desk, holster clicking shut. "I'll be fine. Just need to sleep." I turned toward the door, cloak of exhaustion dragging my shoulders down. As I stepped out into the pre-dawn chill, I forced myself to look at the empty lot across the street, where broken glass still glittered, where the motel sign waited to flicker back to life. I saw the silhouette of that teenager's boots, the elderly man at the attic hatch, the toddler in a crib, the blood-stained car seat, and Jane Morales's tossed earring. All ghosts that would trail me to the edge of sleep. My hand hovered on my coat pocket. I closed my fingers around the small brass hoop we'd recovered, warm from my grip. I held it up before slipping it back in, knowing it would sit there all day, a reminder. I exhaled, shoulders slackening. The dark had finally begun to fade, but the memory wouldn't lift. It would follow me home, slip into my dreams, whisper at 3 a.m. with the same patient hunger I'd chased all night. And in that moment, as the first headlights split the dawn, I understood. Some nights don't end. They fold into you, stitching dread into every heartbeat, until you're not sure where the routine ends and the nightmare begins. The wheels of the cruiser crunched over gravel as I turned onto County Line Road once more. This time, in the pale wash of pre-dawn, the world tipped between night and day, neither comforting nor safe. The call had come in just after 23:30. Possible disturbance in progress at abandoned farmstead, west side. It was the kind of routine notification that used to offer a break from the hospital corridors and highway chases. But tonight, I felt every step settling like stones in my gut. I parked under the skeletal remains of an old oak, its branches gnarled against the dim sky. The farmstead lay back 50 yards, a whitewashed barn with paint flaking in mushrooms of rot, a farmhouse sagging at the porch with broken windows boarded in mismatched plywood. Every board was a sentence of neglect. I slipped out of the cruiser, checking my maglite and secondary radio, heart already tapped by exhaustion. Footfalls were silent on the dew-soaked grass. I moved with the dogged patience that comes only after countless midnight calls. Flashlight in my left hand, finger off the trigger of my revolver in the right. The barn door sagged open with a groan, like a moan of warning. I pressed my shoulder to the frame and eased inside. The beam of my light found a tangle of old milking equipment, rusted saddles, and a mound of what looked like burlap sacks heaped in the corner. I swept the light across the floor. Footprints and powdery dust trailing toward a back room sealed by a rotting door. The footprints, bare, small, too narrow to match the suspect from last night, ended at the threshold. I pressed my palm to the cold wood, felt the grain give under my weight, and pushed it inward. The room beyond was empty except for a single rocking chair perched in the center, its seat worn smooth, the rocker rails gouged in places. In the darkness, the chair creaked as though pushed by unseen hands. I stepped closer, every nerve alight. The air tasted of mildew and old secrets. I knelt beside the chair, swept my light across the floor. Footprints in concentric circles, as if someone had paced, waited, then doubled back. Behind me, the barn door slammed shut with a thunderous bang. Wood against wood, the sound of a trap snapping. The hair on my neck stood up. I drew my revolver, every muscle strung taut. The rocking slowed, then stopped. Silence swallowed me, so complete I could hear my own pulse. Then a whisper, soft, accented, unintelligible, drifting from somewhere above. I swept the beam upward, catching the loft where shadows gathered like feathers. The ladder that led there was gone. My heart thundered as though I'd leapt off a cliff. I radioed dispatch, voice low. Unit 52, reporting containment breach at Farmstead. Possible trespasser inside. Request immediate backup. No response. The radio crackled only static. I cursed under my breath. The rocking began again, slow, deliberate, as though marking time. I edged around the chair, each step a negotiation with fear. My flashlight caught movement across the wall, scrawled in what looked like dried mud, a phrase. 2 words that broke through my training. Stay with me. I swallowed, breath ragged. The words seemed to flex in the beam, as though written by living hands. My revolver shook as the weight of the barn pressed in. I stepped forward, rasped out, "Show yourself." The rocking halted. The whisper returned, closer now, threaded with a child's voice. "Please." I scanned the rafters. There, perched on a beam, naked to the waist, knobby knees hugging a bony chest, sat a boy, maybe 12, eyes wide, reflective as dark glass. His hair hung in greasy tangles, and his ribs showed beneath pale skin. He rocked the chair with one trembling foot. I cursed again, holster now empty, mind screaming. "Where are your parents? What are you doing here?" He tilted his head, lips moving soundlessly. The barn's shadows pooled at the edges of my light, thick as nightmares come alive. My throat closed. Below me, the rocking chair creaked faster, as though the boy's heartbeat pulsed through its timbers. I took a step back, memories colliding. The toddler huddled under the quilt, the grandfather in the attic, Jane Morales in the creek, the stolen earrings' hollow glint. The boy's voice, when it came, was dead quiet, a rasp that curled around my ribs. "I don't want to be alone." My vision swam. Every routine call, every silent house had led me here, to this fragment of terror crouched in the dark. I wanted to reach for him, to offer help, but the boy's eyes were too vast, too ancient, and I froze, knowing that no words could bridge the gulf between us. The rocking stopped. The barn settled into stillness as if the world held its breath. And then the boy leapt toward me, landing on trembling legs with a thud that shook the boarded floor. He stared up, hand extended, fingers trembling like broken wings. For a moment, I thought he might collapse into me, begging for salvation. Instead, he smiled, and in that ragged curve of his lips lay every echo of despair I'd heard all night. Every scream I hadn't answered, every body I couldn't save. I closed my eyes, took a shaky breath, and when I opened them, the beam of my flashlight revealed only dust motes drifting in the lean of morning light. The rocking chair stood empty, unscarred, rocking gently as though moved by a breeze that hadn't stirred. I stepped back, willing my legs not to buckle, heart pounding like a gavel. I sprinted for the barn door, flung it open, and tumbled into the chill of dawn, light pouring in as though justice itself had cracked the sky. Behind me, the whisper of child's voice trailed off into silence, and the rocking chair slowed to a halt against the hush of empty stillness. I drove away without looking back. The boy, whatever he was, remained in the barn, and in the hollow of my chest, where routine calls had gathered like stones. Every heartbeat echoed with his silent plea. When I finally reached the station and stepped inside, the harsh glare of fluorescent lights felt as cold as stars. I unbuckled my belt, holster empty, uniform stained with dew and fear. I didn't go home that morning. I didn't file the report. I stood at my desk, trembling, and listened for the echo of a child's voice in the whisper of the wind against the window. And when I closed my eyes that afternoon, I still saw his smile, those two wide eyes, the reach of his small, pale hand, and I realized, with a quiet, devastating certainty, that some calls never end. I didn't sleep that afternoon. Instead, I stayed at my desk well past quitting time, lights flickering overhead as I stared at the blank report template on my screen. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, but no words would come. The barn, the boy, his too wide smile, all circling in my head like vultures over fresh roadkill. I could still hear the hollow whisper of, "I don't want to be alone," as vivid now as it was when I first crossed that threshold. I shut down the computer and grabbed my coat. The station was empty, radios silent, only the distant hum of air conditioning and the thump of my own boots on linoleum. I passed the briefing room where the evidence photos still hung. Brake lamp, attic hatch, blood smear, overturned crib, Buick bumper, and Jane's locket. I paused before the last one. The boy wasn't on any chart. No missing persons matched. Nothing in dispatch logs. He didn't exist on paper, and somehow that made his presence more real. Outside, the evening air was cool, and the sky bruised purple. I climbed into my cruiser without thought, the seat cold beneath me. I punched County Line Road into the GPS out of habit, and the engine growled awake. My flashlight lay on the passenger seat, handle still sticky with dew and dust. I didn't want to go back, but I had to. Some questions wouldn't let me rest. The road stretched empty. Endless rows of fields blurred at the edges. My headlights carved a tunnel through the dark. Every so often, I glanced at the rearview mirror. Nothing but the curtained interior and the reflection of my own eyes, puffy and red. I thought I spotted movement once. A figure at the tree line. But when I blinked, it was gone. I arrived at the barn at 2213. The oak out front looked skeletal in the beam of my headlights. I killed the engine and stepped out, boots sinking into damp grass. The stale smell of rot wafted on the breeze, and I swallowed against the lump in my throat. I patted my holster absent-mindedly, revolver empty, but I needed its weight against my hip like a talisman. The barn door was still ajar. I approached with measured steps, flashlight in hand. Inside, the air was colder, heavy, with silence. Dust motes drifted in the beam, and the rocking chair sat in its corner, empty, but for a moment I thought I saw the imprint of someone's small frame in its worn seat. I shone the light upward, searching the loft. It was empty, ladder gone, nothing but shadows curling like smoke. I exhaled in relief, and then I heard it. A soft scuff behind me. I spun, flashlight flicking across rafter beams, down to the hay-covered floor. The boy was there, crouched near the sacks, knees drawn to his chest. His hair was tangled, eyes gleaming in the half-light. My heart thundered, but I didn't raise my weapon. I remembered every time I'd tutelaged someone, cuffed them, carried them away in the back of a cruiser. It had never felt like this. My voice shook as I said, "Why are you here?" He didn't answer. He rose slowly and bowed his head. Then, with a movement too quick for me to follow, he dropped to his knees, pressed his hands together at his chest, and spread them open toward the empty doorway. I hesitated, pulse in my throat. The boy's hands trembled. I felt a surge of sorrow, regret, something primal that made me want to drop to my own knees beside him, to cradle his ghost-like shoulders. But I didn't. He looked up, and for the briefest instant, I saw the terror of every routine call etched in his expression. The dead teen behind the Buick, the battered toddler, the silent attic, the shattered mirror, the overturned cart. And then his face went still, hollowing out until he seemed made of the barn itself, rot and dust and longing. He stood, and I watched him turn away. He moved toward the back wall, where the boarding had warped in the years, leaving cracks that let the night wind sigh through. He pressed his palm to the wood, as if placing a hand on the souls trapped inside. Then he took one slow step backward, and in the dim glow, I saw tears glistening on his cheeks. He raised a finger and pointed at me, just one finger, and I felt the weight of that accusation, that I'd walked all night, answered every call, but never truly seen him until now. He turned, vanished into the darkness beyond the barn door. I stood there, chest hollow, listening to the rocking chair's empty sigh as it tipped forward, then back, then stilled. My flashlight flickered, and I felt the barn breathe around me. I'm not sure how long I stood before I found the strength to move. I closed the door behind me, the wood groaning a final lament. Back in the cruiser, I sat with the engine off, headlights cutting through the fog. My hands shook. I drew a ragged breath and whispered, "I see you." Then I drove away into the night, carrying every silent plea, every broken echo, knowing I'd never be free of them. And as the barn faded behind me, I realized I would never stop listening for that soft step, that too-wide smile, that small hand reaching into the dark. I climbed into the patrol car at precisely 0002. The seat still held the faint imprint of my partner's weight, though he'd long since gone home. I nodded at the dim glow of the dash, flicked on the body mic and eased onto the road. The radio crackled once, then slipped silent. Nothing but the whisper of tires on damp asphalt and the low hum of the heater. The night was one of those late May evenings that cling to spring's chill. Dew beating on the grass and coating the highway lines in a slick sheen. My first call came 10 minutes later. A traffic stop on County Route 12. A stretch of two-lane ribbon that cuts through endless cornfields and the kind of darkness that feels alive. The report: faded taillight. I flicked on the overheads, spotlight swinging toward the roadside. There stood a weathered Camry, its right taillight flickering like a dying candle. I eased the cruiser so the passenger door lined with mine, radioing in the stop while checking mirrors and gauge lights. I climbed out, boots crunching gravel. The driver's window slid down. A kid, maybe 20 at most, eyes hollow, hands steady on the wheel but shoulders slumped like he carried more weight than his age should allow. "Evening, son. License and registration, please." My voice was standard, but my gaze shifted to the back seat, where an empty car seat sat buckled in place. He swallowed hard, fumbling in his jacket. "Sorry, officer, I had my niece back there, but I dropped her at my sister's before I left." His words were earnest, but he didn't look at me. He stared past my shoulder as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. I leaned in, flashlight grazing the Camry's interior, a stray juice box in the cup holder, a discarded toy truck under the front seat, fingerprints smudged in dust on the door panel. Routine. "All right, just heads up, that tail light's out. I'll give you a warning today." He nodded, relief flickering across his face. Then his gaze darted again to the shoulder of the road. "Thanks, officer." I climbed back in and watched him pull away, the Camry's brake lights fading down the curve. But in the rearview mirror, I thought I saw a figure, someone standing at the edge of the field, half in shadow, half illuminated by the glow of the passing headlights. I blinked. Nothing. The field lay empty under the slash of moonlight. I shook it off as fatigue and eased forward. By 0045, I was threading into Crestwood subdivision, a grid of 2 identical houses under weak street lamps, each front yard a patchwork of uncut grass and discarded mail. Dispatch pinged. Welfare check at 14 Maple Drive. Neighbor concerned he hadn't seen the homeowner in days. I turned down the street, vinyl siding glowing pale under yellow light. The porch light was knocked out, bare bulb socket dangling like a staring eye without an iris. The front door hung ajar. I clicked secure on the radio and set my hand on the holster. Maple Drive, welfare check, possible occupant inside. I eased through the doorway, air thick with the stale tang of candle wax. Kitchen table set for dinner, 2 plates, half-empty wine glasses, a single lit taper guttering shadows across the tabletop. I called out, voice echoing off drywall, "Nothing." Then, from further in, a metallic drip, drip, drip. Always odd how a sound can fill an entire room. I followed the noise down the narrow hallway, light bouncing off framed wedding photos. One frame had cracked glass, hairline fractures spidering across the smiling faces inside. The drip led me to the bedroom, door closed. I tapped the frame. Nothing. Then the drip ceased. Stillness pressed in. I gave a light kick. The door swung inward. There, on the floor, lay the homeowner. Feet extended toward me, ankles crossed, tangled in what looked like bed sheets. His head was turned away, his hair matted, scalp pale beneath it, spine bent at an awkward angle. I ducked under the bedspread and knelt beside him. He was alive, pulse faint but there, eyes open, fixed on a long rusted nail driven into the wall above the headboard. He mouthed something. I leaned close. Couldn't make it out. "Sir, you okay?" I reached to touch his shoulder. He flinched, eyes widening as if he'd forgotten where he was. I radioed for EMS, then sat beside him on the hardwood floor. My knees hurt, back stiffened, coffee cold in my cup holder. Seconds ticked like hours. He finally blinked, and his eyes landed on me. Terrified, lost. The sight filled me with a hollow dread. I couldn't explain it in training manuals. The feeling that the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. Backup arrived 5 minutes later. I stood and stepped aside, listening to the EMTs. But my mind stayed on the cracked photoglass, the dinner set for 2, the candle flame that refused to die. I climbed back into the cruiser, slid the door shut. The radio crackled. "Unit 12, are you clear?" I acknowledged and rolled out, heading south toward the Highway 9. My hands trembled slightly as I adjusted the mic. Coffee mug rattled in the cup holder. At 1:30, I passed the old mill, headlights catching the broken windows, jagged glass glinting like sinister eyes. My stomach churned. I thought about calling it a night, paperwork tomorrow. But dispatch had another call. Domestic disturbance, 1700 block of Elm. Someone yelling, possible gunshots. I exhaled, tension coiling in my chest. The nightly tally still read 0 arrests, 0 citations. Let's keep it that way, I muttered. I turned on the siren briefly, lights scrolling through the mill's empty windows. Motion in the doorway, no silhouette but a dark shape that vanished when I slowed. My heart thudded. I flipped off the siren and eased into Elm. Elm was quiet. Eucalyptus trees lining the street, leaves whispering in the breeze. Number 1700. White trim, dark shutters, a lawn unkempt. Front door slammed again as I pulled up. I killed the engine, radioing in my arrival. I knocked. Through the door's crack, I saw a small figure. Toddler, clutching a bear. He stared at me wide-eyed, lip trembling. I crouched. "Hey, champ, I'm Officer Davis. Your mom okay?" He pointed upstairs, voice a soft chirp. He left Mommy in the closet. My chest tightened. Closet under the stairs, too small to kneel in. I radioed backup, holstered my firearm, then moved toward the stairwell. Every step creaked, the smell of pine cleaner mixed with something sour. I reached the closet door and paused, hand hovering on the knob. Inside, half in darkness, lay a woman curled against the wall. Eyes closed, bruises dark under her pale skin. She stirred when I stepped in, blanket tangled around her knees. I knelt, voice gentle. "Ma'am, it's okay, I'm here to help." She opened her eyes, sunken, distant. She nodded once, then looked past me as if expecting someone else to appear. Her gaze pierced me, empty and pleading. Paramedics arrived and took over. I waited outside, jacket unzipped to let the night air in. My mind replayed that snapshot, her eyes. The bear's head pressed against her cheek, the closet's cramped darkness. 2:15 a.m. I pulled back onto the road, radio quiet. I was halfway to the station when another call lit up. Suspicious person at the Hitching Post Motel, Route 50. Guest insisted someone was outside his door, watching. I glanced at the neon sign flickering red and green. Classic roadside haven turned hollow. I slowed to a crawl, spotlight skimming empty parking stalls. A single sedan idling near room 12. Windows tinted too dark. I parked behind, lights off, and stepped out. Wind tugged at my jacket. I called over the radio, checking on 12. My boots crunched, the sedan's engine cut. I stopped 10 feet away, no movement inside. I tapped the window, firm knuckle against glass. No response. I circled to the driver's side, tawser in hand, ready to flip the circuit. Before I reached for the handle, the room door clicked behind me. I spun, the hallway light swelled and contracted. No one there, my breath caught. I swallowed. The motel air felt too still, thick like syrup. The guest's door stood open just an inch, darkness pooling beyond. I knocked, steady voice. No answer. The corridor was silent except for my breathing and a distant hum of the neon sign. I drew my taser and edged inside. The carpet smelled of mildew. Room 12 was empty. Bed neatly made, nightstand lamp off, curtains drawn tight. I swept the beam. A suitcase open on the bed, clothes neatly folded, hotel shampoo untouched. No sign of struggle, no one to chase. I left, heart thumping so loud it drowned the radio in my ears. Back at the cruiser, I sank onto the seat, grief and adrenaline mingling in my chest. Coffee long cold, tail light flicker, candle in a dead house, child in a closet. An empty motel room. None made sense, but each laid another brick on the weight in my gut. At 3:30, I radioed in. 12-hour shift. 5 calls, 0 arrests. Starting to feel like a vector for sorrow. I laughed softly at myself. The miles ticked by in street lamp stutter. By 4 a.m., I was 2 hours from shift end, thoughts turning inward. Each stop had stripped something away: confidence, innocence, the illusion of control. I pulled into the station at 5:58. The lot was deserted save one tow truck. I killed the engine, silence roaring. I unbuckled, hands still, looking at the patrol car's worn vinyl. The night's stories pressed behind my eyes like film in a projector, looping. I pocketed the mic and stepped into the cool pre-dawn. My badge felt heavy under my shirt. I thought about sleep, but knew the images and sounds would follow me. The kid's haunted glance, the man pinned to the floor by fear, the bruise-marked mother, the empty motel, the hush of the corridor. I locked the cruiser and walked inside. The shift log sat on the counter, blank lines waiting. I hesitated, pen in hand, then set it down. Something in me wouldn't let me write. Instead, I stepped into the locker room, removed my jacket, and hung it by the door. In the mirror, I studied my eyes, bloodshot, shadowed. I touched the badge imprint in my shirt. No miracle fix, no single moment to pin the horror on. Just 1,000 tiny cuts of disbelief, bruises to the soul. I exhaled. The station lights hummed overhead. Outside, the world still slumbered, unaware of the scars each routine call left behind. I stepped away, boots echoing on tile, and let the silence swallow me whole. I pushed through the heavy door of the locker room and let it thud shut behind me, the click echoing like a judge's gavel. Dawn's pale light seeped through the narrow windows, coloring the gray walls in faint gold. I dropped my gun belt onto the bench, the steel of my holster rattling against my keys. My boots, still caked with gravel from Elm Street, thudded against the vinyl floor as I shuffled toward the shower. Steam hissed against cold tile when I cracked the knob, and I let the hot water run over me, scalding at first, then soothing, until the tension in my shoulders loosened just enough to sting. My uniform clung to my skin, the scent of stale coffee and motel mildew washed away down the drain. I closed my eyes, imagining each droplet carried a fragment of the night's horrors into the pipes. Yet, even as the steam swirled, I could still see them. The girl's toy truck glinting under the taillight's glow. The man's blank stare at that nail, the shattered closet door, the hush of the empty room. When I stepped out, my skin pink and pruned, I found my second wind. I toweled off, changed into a fresh shirt, plain gray, nothing tactical, and grabbed a protein bar from the locker. The first bite tasted like cardboard, but I swallowed it anyway. Outside, the station's parking lot was still quiet. The shift log sat untouched on the front desk through the glass. I thought briefly of scribbling something. Case notes, maybe a confession, but the words wouldn't come. I left without ceremony, walking instead to my personal car parked in the employee lot. I unlocked it with a soft beep and slid behind the wheel. My morning commute beginning not at home, but here at coffee shop across town. The old Chevy roared to life, and I pulled onto the main road, window down a crack to catch the sense of a waking city. Fresh pastry from the bakery, gasoline from a filling station, and something under it all, something metallic and sharp. I reached Java Junction at 6:15. The place was already busy. Nurses in scrubs sipping lattes, early shift dock workers slurping black coffee, a lone jogger tucking his phone back into a fanny pack. I ordered a double espresso and a cinnamon roll, then claimed a seat by the window. My reflection stared back at me, haggard, unshaven, eyes rimmed red like an overused witness. I placed the mug to my lips and sipped. The bitterness felt honest. Halfway through my roll, my phone buzzed. A text from home. "Don't forget to walk Bella before work." Bella was our golden retriever. I stared at the word "before," like it belonged to someone else's schedule. I typed back, "Will do. Be home soon." Then locked the screen and set the phone face down. The next call came at precisely 7:02, just as I was pulling onto Oak Street toward Precinct. Dispatch, suspicious package at the community center. I chugged the rest of the espresso, tossed the paper cup in the bin, and started the Chevy again. By the time I rolled up to the center, the sun was high enough that my boots didn't cast long shadows. A white van idled at the curb, engine off, doors closed. A lone maintenance worker hovered 20 feet away, arms crossed. I rolled my window down. "Morning, sir. Anything wrong with that van?" He pointed. "Parked here half an hour. No tags. Looks abandoned." I nodded. "I'll check it out." I popped the door and walked toward the passenger side. Every step cracked gravel, and the air smelled of fertilizer from the soccer fields behind the building. The van's windows were tinted, opaque, but not so dark as to defy the sun. I tapped the glass. Dull thud. Then the sliding door's latch clicked. I jumped back, hand on my holster before remembering to keep it holstered. The door squealed open. No one inside, just a duffel bag on the floor. I circled, gun hand ready but not drawing, and peered in. The bag was frisbee blue, nylon, left unzipped so a battered journal lay half exposed. I knelt, reached in and flipped it open. Pages of scrawled writing, date stamps scribbled in haste, entries about voices in the walls, figures lurking beyond sight. Midnight sermons delivered by empty chairs. I felt as though I'd found the field report of someone unhinged, a journal full of paranoid prophecy. My stomach turned. I glanced down Mill Road and caught sight of a woman jogging past, earbuds in, oblivious to the van and its secrets. I closed the journal and bagged it, then radioed dispatch. Unit 12 to HQ, evidence pickup at community center, possible mental health call. Back in the Chevy, I stared at the bag as though it might explain the night's string of horrors. Instead, it just sat there, a cordoned-off question mark waiting for forensic. I started the engine and peeled away, mind looping over the entries I'd glimpsed. By 8 o'clock, I was back at our tiny precinct, the echo of bootsteps in the corridor reminding me I was an unwelcome visitor in this place of paperwork and bureaucracy. I handed the duffel to the evidence tech, who nodded without looking up. "Good catch, Davis." I shrugged and headed upstairs to the briefing room. The shift commander stood at the head of the table, a stubby man with a permanent crease between his brows. He raised an eyebrow when I walked in. "Late night, late morning?" he asked. I offered a tight smile, sank into a chair. Other officers filed in, yawns and coffee in hand. The commander cleared his throat. "Quick rundown. Today's priority is traffic enforcement on Main Street. School zone's a disaster. Lunch at 1, precinct doors open at 2 for Citizens Academy tour." Everyone groaned. I glanced at my watch, 8:15. Citizens Academy would be a half-hour lecture, 2 hours of answering questions about Miranda rights and taser safety. I pressed my lips together. My mind replayed the night, the torque of the man studying my face before turning hostile, the woman's distant plea, the kid's haunted glance. The commander droned on about speed limits. My co-worker, Officer Ramirez, fresh out of training, fiddled with a pen. She looked at me. "Rough night?" I managed a nod, eyes locked on the whiteboard. Just routine calls. I excused myself, slipping out of the briefing. The corridor was empty. I paused, hand on the door frame. In that quiet, I heard my own breathing, the hum of the overhead lights, the distant thunk of a file drawer closing. My chest tightened. I walked back to my locker, dropped my badge and radio on the shelf, and reached for the mental health pamphlets AC had left behind from last week's in-service. Titles like Crisis Intervention Techniques and De-escalating the Psychotic Mind. I thumbed through them, each page full of jargon, bullet points, and hypothetical scenarios, none matching the haggard man staring at a nail in a bedroom, none explaining the journal's murmured warnings. By 9 a.m., I was at the Citizens Academy desk, fielding questions about dog-to-dog chases and accident reconstruction. Parents asked about community policing. Senior citizens fretted over identity theft. I answered in practiced tones, "Yes, you have the right to remain silent," while my head rang with memories of empty motel rooms and closets that trapped more than just bodies. When the tour ended at 11 o'clock, I finally snagged a quiet corner in the break room. I poured a cup of lukewarm coffee, thin stuff that no one but I drank, and sat at a metal table. I watched the steam rise, twisted my wedding band around and around. For a moment, I considered calling home, hearing Bella's excited bark, my wife's voice telling me everything would be okay, but my throat tightened at the thought. Instead, I grabbed a thick envelope labeled Field Interview Reports and began the tedious work. Transcribing my notes from the night onto official forms, lines for suspect descriptions, victim statements, narrative summary. With each word I typed, officer observed subject, EMS transported to hospital, evidence logged into property room, I felt as though I was carving away at my own memory, sanitizing the raw edge of what had happened. By the time I signed off at noon, the sun was fully overhead, and the station's windows bled white light across the linoleum. I closed the laptop, packed my things, and headed back to my car, my third vehicle of the morning. I swallowed down a cough, the taste of stale coffee stuck in my mouth. As I drove home, suburbs giving way to tree-lined streets, I rehearsed the conversation I'd have with my wife. Long day. So many calls. I'd say it like a shield. But inside, I wondered, how do you explain the echo of a child's sob at 3 a.m., the vacant stare of a man drawn to violence he couldn't name, the hollow space of a motel room that watched you back? I pulled into our driveway at 12:47, dog leash in hand. Bella bolted for the door, tail a propeller. My wife appeared behind her, smile bright. She ruffled my hair. "Rough shift?" I knelt, scratching Bella behind the ears. She leaned into me, eyes warm. My wife touched my shoulder. "Coffee?" she offered. I looked at her, soft, forgiving, her world untouched by last night's ghosts. I shook my head slowly. "Not yet." I closed my eyes for a second, breathing in the scent of home, laundry detergent, fresh bread. I stood, leash in hand, and stepped onto the lawn, feeling the grass cool beneath my boots. As we walked, each footstep pressed into dew-damp earth, and I realized I was living two lives, one under streetlights and sirens, the other under morning sun and familiar voices. They both demanded everything of me, and neither let me rest. I glanced at Bella trotting beside me, her silhouette crisp against the pale green grass. For a moment, peace, then the night's echoes surged back. Footsteps in the hallway, a toddler's whisper, the echo of that clicking motel door. And I walked on, listening. I eased out of the driveway, Bella tugging at the leash as if she remembered better roads than I did, nose to the ground in that blissful canine oblivion. The morning light filtered through budding maples, and for a moment the world felt balanced. Until my phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with dispatch. Unknown disturbance, Pine Ridge Apartments, 8:12 a.m. I exhaled, tension coiling back in my chest as I turned toward the freeway entrance. Bella gave one sharp bark, as if protesting, but I clipped the leash to the railing and promised a longer walk later. The Chevy's engine roared to life, and I punched the address into the GPS. Pine Ridge was a jumbled cluster of stucco buildings and chain-link fences, halfway between affordable housing and halfway abandoned. By 8:30, I parked under a sagging carport, cruiser lights off. I grabbed my holster, clipped on my radio, and stepped across cracked concrete toward Building C, Unit 214. The walkway was littered with soda cans and torn flyers advertising payday loans. I nodded at a teenager slouched against the stucco wall, earbuds in, eyes flicking up only to watch me pass. I knocked with 3 short raps. A mumble inside, then the door creaked open on a single hinge. Dim light seeped from within, carpet threadbare, walls scuffed. I called a quiet, "Hello? Officer Davis, is anyone here need help?" No answer. I stepped in, flashlight beam cutting through stale air. The living room was strewn with overturned furniture, a coffee table on its side, a recliner leg snapped off. On the couch sat an elderly woman in a floral dress, hair streaked gray, hands cupped around a chipped teacup. She watched me through rheumy eyes, silent as a statue. "Ma'am, I got a call about yelling." I kept voice low, calming. She shook her head and pointed to the hallway, lips moving soundlessly. I followed her gesture down a narrow corridor. A child's drawing taped to the wall. Stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun, bright and incongruous. At the end, a half-open door revealed a nursery painted mint green. A crib lay overturned, sheets torn away in ragged strips. The room smelled faintly of ammonia. I knelt, scanning the floor. A small doll, its face cracked, its clothes stained. Nothing else. I felt my pulse hammer, the silence pressed too heavy. Behind me, the woman's soft shuffle. I looked up and found her leaning against the doorframe, teacup in hand. "They took him," she whispered, voice ragged. I frowned. "Took who?" She pointed to a photo on the nightstand. An infant in a pastel onesie, eyes bright, grin toothless. I lifted the picture gingerly, mindful of smudges on its glass surface. The woman's head wobbled. "The ghost," she said, voice breaking. My stomach knotted. I clipped the photo into an evidence bag, heart skating on panic. "Ma'am, there's no ghost. This is a missing child report, right? You called for a welfare check?" She shook her head again, tears pooling. "No, officer. I called because he's still here, watching." My throat went dry. I stepped back toward the doorway, expecting a child to leap out from behind the bed, something real and tangible. But the corridor remained empty, the overhead bulb buzzing like a trapped insect. The woman hissed, "He never left." I reached for the radio. "Unit 12, requesting EMS and CS at Pine Ridge, possible abduction." My words stumbled out, and I felt ridiculous. No abduction, no child. But her fear was real. She closed her eyes, tears tracing rivulets down her cheeks. A low sob shook her shoulder. I knelt before her. "Ma'am, let's step into the living room. I'll get you some water." I saw her eyes flick again, corner of my vision, toward the nursery door. Slowly, she rose and followed. Her gait was unsteady. I half led her, guiding her arm under mine. Back in the living room, I set her on the couch and offered water from my bottle. Her hand trembled as she brought it to her lips. The EMTs arrived with a flurry of gear, defibrillator cases and trauma kits. I watched them work on her as they asked for medical history. She blinked at them, confused. clutching the water bottle like a lifeline. I stepped outside to clear my head. The air was crisp, syrupy with summer promise. A cluster of neighbors gathered, eyes wide, phones raised. I held up my hand. "Please give us space." They backed off, muttering among themselves. I walked to my cruiser and stared at the nursery photo tucked under my arm. The baby's smile seemed too knowing, as if daring me to prove the woman wrong. By 9:45, the CS van rumbled in, officers in gloves unpacking evidence bags. I hovered near the entrance, adrenaline draining. I watched the woman, now sipped into a wheelchair, stare at the nursery door as if expecting a shadow to slip through. I leaned against the cruiser, glancing at the clock, 10:01 a.m. Less than an hour until my next scheduled mid-shift lunch. My stomach twisted at the idea of sandwiches. Instead, I popped open the trunk and looked at the duffel bag from the community center, journal pages scribbled with fear. Now this, patterns forming in the dark. I closed the trunk and climbed in the driver's seat. My arm brushed the old radio handset and I gripped it. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I'm clear at Pine Ridge. I'll continue to 1600 block, possible vandalism. Over." The response crackled weakly. I flicked off the mic and stared at the nursery photo on the dash. Then I slid it into the glove compartment, locked away. I backed out, the stroller frame that wasn't there still lodged in my mind. Children belong in cribs, not in the patterns of dread that trace police logs. I drove off, headlights carving a path through the morning gloom. At 11:30, I paused at a school crossing. Kids in uniforms lining up, laughter bouncing off brick walls. I watched them, faces bright, unaware of the darkness that shadows those meant to protect. I thought of the woman in mint green, teacup in hand, grief pinning her to a world unseen. The radio buzzed again, nothing. I let the silence wash over me as the crossing guard waved us through. My foot eased off the brake, and the Chevy rolled onto Main Street where speed limits dropped to 20. I tapped the horn twice at a silver sedan creeping past. The driver yawned at me, inconspicuous as daylight. I shifted into gear, the car sliding forward, and I realized the day had become night's twin, each decision as grave as a midnight call. The patterns remained. Empty seats, overturned cribs, half-heard whispers, journals of madness. I needed answers, but knew better than to expect closure. I parked at precinct for a paperwork handoff. Forms for the old woman, the baby photo, extra patrol logs. As I stepped out, I felt the weight of 7 hours since I'd left home, the gravel under my boots now replaced by tile echoing beneath fluorescence. Inside, my partner sat at a desk, flipping through reports with practiced detachment. He looked up. "Rough morning?" I nodded, handing him my folder. "One for the weird file?" He smiled thinly. "We've got another call at the industrial park. Lights out, no one in sight. Want to finish lunch?" I shook my head. "I'll grab something later." I headed toward records, ready to inventory the day's incidents, but aware that each scribble on the form was a fresh cut. The office smelled of toner and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed. I exhaled and sank into a chair, lifted the top report. "Unknown disturbance, Pine Ridge." I paused at the description. "Resident reports unseen presence, no signs of forced entry." My pen hovered, then scratched across the line. "Report taken, follow-up pending." I closed the file and stacked it neatly. Behind me, the corridor stretched into the precinct like a funnel, offices and interrogation rooms opening off it. I felt the walls pressing in, the stale air in lungs less forgiving than the cool night breeze. The clock on the wall ticked noon. The day's third chore was a juvenile theft at the mall. I stood, straightened my shirt, and reached for the radio. But before I spoke, I took a breath. A steadied, measured breath, and listened. Silence answered. And I realized that in this line of work, the quiet can be as loud as any siren. As I stepped into the corridor, the lights flickered once, settled, and I moved on. The precinct's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I stepped into the hallway, radio clipped at my shoulder. The printer and records spat out the juvenile theft report. Shoplifting at Cedar Mall. I tucked the file under my arm and passed interrogation rooms with darkened windows. Toward the exit, the locker room loomed, but I bypassed it. No time to decompress. I needed to finish my shift strong, though strong felt increasingly hollow. Outside, the afternoon sun sat low in the sky, dragging shadows across the parking lot. My cruiser waited, dust-coated and waiting like an old friend. I tossed the report onto the passenger seat and climbed in, engine rumbling awake. Behind me, the tow truck rumbled off. Its driver waved. I nodded without enthusiasm. The open road called, but the weight in my gut told me nothing would feel open again. Traffic was thin as I steered toward Cedar Mall, a collection of chain stores and food courts, glass facades reflecting late-day glare. I radioed dispatch. Unit 12 en route to Cedar Mall for juvenile theft. ETA 5. My voice sounded flat, rehearsed. The mall loomed as I approached the south entrance, where security guards had corralled a teenager behind orange traffic cones. The kid looked barely 15, skinny frame slumped under a too-big hoodie, face pale. A half-stolen hoodie draped over his arm. I parked and joined the pair. Security Officer Jacobs, broad-shouldered with a permanent scowl, and the kid, eyes flicking between us. Jacobs recited the story. Spotted stuffing merchandise into his bag. Grabbed him after he cut through the clearance racks. He pushed the stolen coat forward. "Your turn, officer." I inhaled a ragged breath and crouched to eye level. "Hey, buddy, what's going on tonight?" My tone aimed for calm, but my chest felt tight. The boy blinked, tears building. I needed something," he whispered, voice cracking. "My mom can't. Dad's gone. We didn't have any food." I glanced at Jacobs, whose expression softened briefly, then hardened again. I radioed for the juvenile unit to respond for formal paperwork. Then I reached for my notebook. "Your name?" He told me. I wrote it down, each letter a confession of his broken home. We moved inside the cruiser to fill out statements. He tucked the stolen hoodie on the seat, careful not to touch the door. His fingers lingered on the torn fabric. I listened as he described empty cupboards, arguments at 2 a.m., the night his father left and didn't return. With each word, my own memories stirred. The woman in mint green, the blank stare at the nail, the nursery's chaos. And I forced myself to focus on this kid's trembling voice. After the juvenile unit arrived, I handed off control and watched him disappear through the security door. The hoodie and mugshot lined up on the console like evidence of someone's life unspooling. I exhaled and slid back into the driver's seat, heart still humming with residual dread. The next call flashed. Welfare check for a woman living alone on Birchwood Lane. She'd missed her dialysis appointment, neighbor concerned. I glanced at the clock, 2:15 p.m. How many more checks before my soul ran out of room for new horrors? I steered toward Birchwood, a street of suburban chunks, medallion lawns, mailboxes painted festive red. Dispatcher updated. "No answer at door, phone dead." The radio crackled with traffic updates that felt irrelevant. I arrived at 2:30, shrouded by oak canopies. A white sedan idled on the curb, engine cold. I parked behind it and grabbed my flashlight, tucking my gun hand in a casual clamp at my belt. front door wide open. The hinge creaked as I nudged it, entering a living room sunlit through lace curtains. A half-packed suitcase sat on the sofa, clothes folded but unlaced, as if someone left mid-motion. Nothing on the counters, dishes stacked neatly. I called her name. No echo answered. I noticed a calendar on the fridge marked with bright red. Dialysis. Friday, June 6th. It was Monday. I frowned, stepped deeper. Then a muffled cough from the bedroom. I slipped down the hallway. The door's edge was lined with scuff marks, as if someone had tried to barricade it. I knocked. "Miss Charles, it's Officer Davis." The cough came again, deeper. I pushed the door gently open. Inside, an elderly woman lay on her side, head tucked under a pillow, blankets tangled around her legs. The mattress sagged under her weight, frame groaning. I knelt beside her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" She cracked an eye. I offered water from my bottle. She sipped, then placed the glass on the nightstand with trembling resolve. She pointed at the floor, voice raspy. "I can't leave." My breath caught. "Can you stand? I'll help you." She shook her head. We tried. I tried to walk out. But the floor, it moves. My skin prickled. I scanned the hardwood, immaculate, polished. No ripples. My knees buckled for a moment. If I looked too long, everything quivered. I brushed at imaginary dust. "I'm calling EMS," I said, voice steadier. I fumbled for the radio, but as I looked back, the woman's eyes were closed again. I placed a hand on her shoulder, heart racing. Within minutes, paramedics arrived. They prepped her for transport, while I escorted them. As I backed out of the house, I glanced at the open door, shadowed interior, furniture still, but the floor somehow seemed to tremble. I shook my head, climbed into the cruiser, and shut the door. My reflection stared back at me. A man unraveling. 2 calls remained. A suspicious vehicle on Route 77 and a noise complaint at Jackson Avenue. I chose Route 77, hoping an open stretch would clear my head. The highway ribboned out, fields and telephone poles sliding by. I slowed at the reported location. A dark sedan parked on the shoulder, engine off, lights still on. I pulled alongside. The driver's door sagged, mirror cracked. I knocked on the window, no response. I circled behind, flashlight ready, heart pounding. No one inside, keys in the ignition. I lifted the hood latch, engine quiet. Under the hood, engine components sat undisturbed, wires neat, nothing soaking. I closed the hood. The silence was horrifying. No footfalls, no whisper of movement. I radioed for tow. I climbed back in and sat, idling, the blue lights pulsing against tall grass. Then the radio static grew louder, as if near my ear. I reached for the mic but paused. The static had a rhythm, almost a sigh. I turned in the seat toward the dark seat behind me, empty. The radio crackled. "Unit 12? I blinked. Yes. Tow dispatched. I eased onto the road, lights trailing. The final call. Noise complaint to Jackson Avenue, house party gone silent. I arrived at 4:45 p.m., dark windows, door locked. I pounded. No answer. I keyed the mic. "Dispatch, clear here." No sound, no lights. I started to leave when a single window upstairs snapped shut. My pulse spiked. I circled front, back, garage. Nothing. The sidewalk lay strewn with crushed beer cans. I thought of that nursery, that closet, that basement dripping water. The alley behind the house offered a side entrance. A loose board at the base of the fence. I slipped through. Yard overgrown, wild rose thorns tugging at my pants. I crept closer to a basement window. Moonlight, no, sunlight, filtered in dusty beams. Cobwebs drifted. I shone my flashlight. the living room furniture upside down on the ceiling like an alien world. Chairs and couches appeared glued overhead. I stumbled back, heart racing. Above, the single window opened and a hand, gloved in black, slipped through, fingertips trailing the glass. I leaned in, no face visible. The hand pulled something, a folded note, which fluttered to the grass. I grabbed it, unfolded. "You see too much. Join us." My breath caught. The mailbox across the street read, "Jackson and 12th" in peeling paint. I bolted back through the fence, yanked my phone free to snap a picture of the upside-down furniture through the basement window, but the screen glowed blank. Camera app frozen. I shook the phone. It buzzed once, then died. I dropped it. Kicked up a spray of gravel. My boots hit pavement as I sprinted to my cruiser. Heart pounding, I slammed the door shut, fumbled keys in ignition. As I peeled away, I caught movement at the upstairs window. 2 feet dangling over the sill, as if someone had stepped out into nothing. I froze on the accelerator, then rounded the corner. My hands trembled on the wheel, cold sweat, adrenaline laced with irrational terror. I forced my heart rate down by humming a dull tune. The Chevy's engine roared through silent neighborhoods until I reached the station at 5:30 p.m., half-hour before shift end. I entered without greeting, headed straight to the locker room. There, I unbuckled my belt and let the weight of calls press down in slow motion. The kid who stole out of hunger, the woman trapped by trembling floors, the empty sedan that breathed static, the basement with gravity undone. Each story folded into a twisted braid of dread that I couldn't untangle. I peeled off my uniform like a second skin and stared at it on the locker hook, bloodless but slick with fear. I reached into my pocket for my phone. Cracked screen, dead battery. I dropped it into the locker and slammed the door. Silence settled in the small room, the locker doors humming in the still air. I pressed my back to the cold metal and slid down until my knees hit the floor. Eyes closed, I braced for the nightmares I knew would come when I finally slept. But tonight, there would be no relief. Only the echo of gravity's betrayal and the knowledge that some calls never end. The station clock read 6:02 p.m., the official end of my shift, but I stayed behind the wheel a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The residue of adrenaline clung to my skin. Every chair squeak in the empty parking garage sounded like a whisper in a funeral parlor. I opened the door and stepped onto cracked concrete, the setting sun painting the walls in bruised purples. I unholstered and slung my belt over my shoulder, each piece of gear landing with a hollow thunk in my compartment. Inside the station, lights flickered in the corridors as offices emptied for the evening. I passed the briefing room where the commander had already left, his coffee mug still stained on the table. My locker sat ajar. I reached in to retrieve my uniform, glancing at the chest rig. Dusty, scratched, scarred by 7 calls that had taken pieces of me. I peeled off the fabric, hanging it loosely, and dropped into my civilian clothes, worn denim and a hoodie that once smelled like home. Now, it smelled like exhaustion. I exited through the side doors into a warm breeze that carried the distant hum of highway traffic. Toward the east, the freeway glowed with brake lights, arteries of red pulsing through the dusk. I walked to my personal car, jamming the key fob. The hatchback sprang open, and I tossed in my badge, radio, and flashlight. The duffel bag from the community center journals lay at my feet, but I left it behind. Evidence operations would handle it. My phone still dead in the locker, I smiled grimly. Some things never change. I cranked the ignition and eased onto the main drag, corridors of streetlights and shuttered storefronts passing in grayscale. My destination wasn't home, not yet. Instead, I pulled off at the exit for the old roadside diner, where night shift cops and tow truck drivers gathered. Cheap coffee and stale pie waiting for anyone who wanted to unburden. The neon sign, red, flickering, spelled Sam's in half its letters, casting a lopsided glow across the parking lot. I parked and joined the few regulars at the counter. Tired faces, grease-stained napkins, a jukebox playing a distant country ballad. I ordered black coffee and a slice of cherry pie, the waitress nodding as if she'd seen it all before. I paid cash, my only transaction today beyond paperwork, and slid onto a stool. I raised the mug, inhaling bitter steam, and closed my eyes. The diner lights buzzed overhead. The world beyond these windows seemed to hold its breath. I drew in a ragged sip and set the mug down. My hands shook slightly as I picked up the fork and speared a piece of pie, sweet cherry filling oozing warm syrup. I chewed mindlessly while I watched the steam swirl in the coffee cup. Behind the counter, the waitress refilled mugs without a word, her face a mask of practiced neutrality. My phone vibrated in my pocket, a courtesy buzz from the station dispatch resetting schedules. I ignored it. There was no message I needed. Instead, I leaned back, letting the booth cradle me, and stared at my reflection in the window behind the counter, a man unmade by his own day, reflected twice, once in glass, once in soul. Cherry seeds caught between my teeth. I flicked them away and exhaled. The diner's neon bled across my hoodie, red splotches dancing like wounds on fabric. I wondered if I'd ever stop hearing that lullaby of gravel under boots, of office lights humming, of voices that weren't there. I stood, dropping bills on the counter, and returned my mug. "Thanks," I mumbled. The waitress nodded curtly. No, take care. No, drive safe. Just the click of heels on linoleum as she backed away. I stepped outside into the night fully formed again. Cop or not, I carried the uniform in my bones. I locked the car and took a slow breath. Across the lot, the old mill stood empty, its windows like dark teeth in a gaping maw. I thought of how I'd scanned its broken panes at 1:30 a.m., heart racing at the idea of nothingness holding secrets. I climbed into the hatchback, settled the seatbelt, and took one last look through the windshield. In the rearview mirror, I saw the neon sign still flickering. AMS, it read now. "You see too much," it seemed to whisper. I turned away, the car's headlights cutting a yellow path down the deserted road. The cherry pie aftertaste lingered on my tongue, sweetness tinged with something bitter I couldn't name. And as I drove toward home, the night unfurled behind me, not in cases closed or answers found, but in the faint echo of gravity's betrayal, of nursery ceilings stretched beyond understanding, of floors that trembled under faith. I still see the cradle rocking itself in the dark, and I know this: some calls never let you go. I pulled off the highway exit and guided the car toward the narrow side street where my house sat half hidden by oaks. The headlights carved slender beams through the dusk, and I reached into the glove compartment for my house key, only to find an old pack of gum and nothing else. My throat tightened. I rummaged in my pockets for my phone. No luck. I glanced at the rearview mirror. My face was ghost pale, hollowed by the night's events. I took a deep breath and eased the door open. The front yard was quiet, twilight settling like ash over the grass. I pushed through the gate, its latch clicking a brittle note in the still air. The porch light flickered to life, casting my elongated shadow across the steps. I climbed them slowly, boot heels echoing on the wood. I pressed my hand to the railing, rough grain under my palm, and felt the tremor in my fingers. Inside, the house was dark, each room swallowed in half light. I flipped the hall light switch. It buzzed, but stayed off. I walked down the corridor, shoes squeaking softly on the laminate floor. The smell of dinner, steak and roasted potatoes, wafted from the kitchen, where a lone bulb glowed above the stove. My wife must have left the stove on a low burner. I called her name, voice hollow. "Sarah?" No answer. I followed the scent to the living room. The recliner sat empty, the TV remote perched on its arm like a silent sentinel. The screen was black, but the red standby dot pulsed steadily. I sank into the couch and set my belt beside me. For a moment I closed my eyes, listening for something. Her footsteps, Bella's bark, the world waking around me. But the silence was absolute, pressed like velvet over every corner. I stood and moved toward the hallway. At the far end, the bedroom door was closed. I knocked gently, 3 soft taps. "Sarah," I whispered. The door opened a crack. I pushed it and stepped inside. The room was cool, moonlight filtering in through half-drawn curtains. Our bed lay unmade, sheets twisted and creased. On the nightstand, my phone lay face down, screen dark. I lifted it, it chirped to life, then died again. Frustration flared in my chest. I tossed it back down. On the dresser, her jewelry box sat open. A single earring glinted in the moonlight. I slid it closed with a snap. I crossed to the bed and sank onto its edge. The mattress dipped under my weight. I stared at the ceiling as if it held the answers, but only pale beams of light cut through the gloom. I rubbed my temples. My mind spun. The nursery's inverted furniture, the trembling floor, the unseen entities that picked at hope. I stood and padded to the bathroom, flicked the light on, and stared at my reflection. Baggy eyes, 5 o'clock shadow, uniform hangover etched on my skin. I splashed cold water on my face, feeling the sting sharpen my senses. I ran fingers through damp hair and caught sight of movement behind me in the mirror. I flicked off the light and the room went dark. When I flicked it back on, no one was there. But the reflection felt wrong. Eyes too wide, expression too haunted. I grabbed a towel and dried off, breathing shallow. I shuffled back to the bedroom, pulled the covers back, and lay down. The bed creaked under the weight, a familiar sound, yet tonight it seemed to complain. I closed my eyes. The world shifted. Images flickered behind my lids, the nursery ceiling inverted, chairs clinging to plaster like barnacles, the empty sedan's silent breath seeping through closed windows, the juvenile's hoodie stained with desperation. Each scene burned for a heartbeat, then faded. I tried to anchor myself in reality. I willed calm into my chest. Minutes passed, or hours. Time blurred in the half-dark. I felt a soft nudge at my feet. I snapped awake, heart pounding. Bella lay curled at the end of the bed, ears perked, eyes glowing in the dark. I exhaled relief and reached down to scratch her head. She leaned into my hand, tail thumping softly. Sarah stirred beside me, turning to face me. In sleep, hair fanned across the pillow. I watched her breathing slow, steady. I wanted to crawl into her warmth and forget the world outside, but I couldn't. The job had stolen peace from me. I slid out of bed, careful not to wake her. I dressed again in uniform. Dark shirt, badge over the heart, gun belt clicking into place. Bella followed me to the door, nose tilted as if sensing departure. I knelt and whispered, "Be good, girl, I'll be back." She whined softly. I kissed the top of her head. Then I stepped into the hallway, closing the door. The floor beneath my boots felt solid, more solid than any call had shown me, but I knew better than to trust it completely. I walked downstairs into the living room. The TV clicked on itself into a static-filled test pattern. The red dot glowed. The thermostat blinked unreadable glyphs. I flicked the lights. None changed. I turned to the window and peered out. Street lamps traced the contour of the lawn, everything in soft focus. Nothing moved. I looked down at my reflection in the glass. Shadows pooled under my eyes, and for the first time, I understood that home wasn't shelter. It was just another environment with its own terrors. And I was stuck in it. I exhaled, turned, and walked to the front door, unlocked it, and stepped outside. The night air wrapped around me, cool, crisp, and I took a deep breath, tasting damp earth and distant traffic. Bella sat on the porch step, tail thumping once in relief at my return. But our reunion felt hollow. I knelt and stroked her fur. She licked my hand, warm and real. I stood, brushing off my uniform, and locked the door behind me. I guided Bella down the steps onto the walkway. Chunks of debris, fallen acorns, stray leaves crunched under our feet. The world felt too large, too empty. I looked up at the sky. Stars pricked the velvet black. Distant fireflies in an ocean. They blinked with indifference. I set Bella's leash aside and let her roam the yard. I paused, hands jammed in pockets. My mind circled back to the calls, the shadows in the perimeter, the whisper that no environment was safe. I stared at the oak's twisted roots, imagining a creature slithering beneath, feeding on fear. I exhaled and touched the bark, feeling its ridges, solid, ancient. A grounding anchor, but every tree had its hollows. I knelt and rubbed Bella's ears, her warmth a thin barrier between me and the void. Night deepened. I knew I should head back inside, to Sarah, to warmth, to something like safety. But I couldn't stop pacing. Each step left a print in the grass, imprinting my passage. I finally climbed to the steps, pulled Bella in, and locked the door. The porch light died. The hallway beyond was pitch. I navigated by memory to the bed. I lay down beside Sarah, careful not to startle her. Bella curled at my feet. The quilt smelled like home, laundry detergent and comfort. I closed my eyes and willed peace into my mind. But as soon as darkness claimed me, I heard it. The soft click of a door upstairs. My daughter's old room, empty for years. I froze, heartbeat stuttered. The click repeated, coming downstairs, floorboards creaking. I blinked awake. Sarah nestled beside me, steady in sleep. Bella snored softly, but the click continued, closer, slower, and I realized it was under our feet, echoing through the walls. I bolted upright, sweat beating on my brow. The room was still, no doors moving, no footsteps. I leaned over and touched Sarah's shoulder. She murmured, half-formed and distant. I unbuckled my belt, slipped off my gun, and set it on the nightstand. I crawled back into bed, pulling the quilt up high. Bella moved, shifting her weight. I closed my eyes once more, willing sleep to claim me before the next click could come. Around us, silence pressed in. Hollow, waiting. And as I lay there, every rational thought drowned by the echo in my skull, I understood. No matter how far I drove, how many doors I locked, how deep I sank into civilian life, the midnight calls would always find me. I woke well before dawn, the sky still a bruise of violet above the oaks. My alarm never sounded. I'd been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, the bed creaking under my weight as if protesting my presence. I stared through the dark window at the street lamp's faint halo on the pavement. No movement, yet sleep remained impossible. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, toes brushing the cool hardwood floor. Sarah still slept, peaceful and untroubled, as if none of last night had touched her world. I envied her oblivion. I dressed again in my uniform. This third donning felt ritualistic, like stepping into armor bespoke for nightmares. Badge polished, name tag clipped straight, belt weighted with tools that felt too heavy now. I paused at the doorway, shoulders braced, and watched Sarah's chest rise and fall beneath the blankets. A soft light through her eyelashes, dreams untroubled. I swallowed, turned away, and slipped downstairs. The kitchen was empty, save for the half-finished casserole from 2 nights ago, still wrapped in foil on the countertop. I poured cold coffee into a to-go mug and drank it black while leaning against the counter. The mug trembled in my hand. I replayed the night's echoes, the nursery chairs glued to the ceiling, the woman's insistence that the floor moved, the ghost's message on the note, the clatter of the basement fence. Each vignette felt less like distinct calls and more like prongs digging into me, probing for weakness. I stepped outside into the pre-dawn hush and keyed my cruiser. Engine rumbled softly, cutting through the silence. As I pulled away, Bella raced beside me on the sidewalk, ears back, tongue lolling in the chill air. I slowed, reached down to scratch her ears through the half-open window. She leaned in, trusting. I closed my eyes for a moment, inhaling her warm fur scent, and then I drove off, leaving home behind until the shift ended. Station lights were bright by 5:30 a.m., windows glowing like beacons against the dark. I parked and climbed out, boots echoing in the empty lot. The door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, the front desk clerk stirred awake behind the glass partition, blinking at the early hour. "Morning, officer," she offered, voice groggy. I offered a curt nod, slid past into the hallway, radio clicking as I reattached it. The world inside felt as distant as a dream. I grabbed the shift binder from the commander's desk. Assignments for patrol, notes on community outreach, mandatory vehicle inspection. My name was penciled in for highway speed enforcement at dawn. I flipped through. No mention of odd calls, no space for the night's horrors. I closed it and slung it back. Paperwork could wait until later. I headed to the roll call room, where a half-dozen officers sat sullenly on folding chairs. The sergeant, young, eager, freshly promoted, piped up, "All right, team, let's run codes, new policies on distracted driving. Remember to use body cam." His words droned, the new policy manual heavy in his hands. I nodded, absently, scanning the group. None looked like they'd shared my night. Their faces were fresh, unscarred by the nightmares I carried. I realized at that moment that no one truly sees the wounds we bear, police, citizen, or neighbor. We're all islands. By 6 a.m., I was back in my cruiser, rolling down the highway. The rising sun split the horizon in fiery gold, a new day born as if to mock the long night. I passed commuters stirring to life. Headlights off now, phones raised to read news feeds or messages from loved ones. They had no idea how close the darkness stayed, how swiftly it could bleed into daylight. I chose a straight stretch of freeway, speed limit 65. I set the cruise control at 70 and settled in, scanning side mirrors and gauges. My mind drifted to the field journal from the van. A man scribbled delirium about walls breathing and chairs crawling with insects. I'd handed that bag off to evidence and let it slip from my thoughts, and yet the words haunted me. They speak in silent words. I felt their echo every time I thought I'd outrun them. At 7 a.m., I switched off the freeway and steered through downtown, shops opening, garbage trucks scraping curbs, morning banter drifting from cafe patios. I circled back toward home. No need to finish the assignment, I realized. The day felt already spent. I'd done my tour. The real calls had come at midnight and danced in my mind all night long. I pulled into my driveway at 7:15, the house unchanged. Windows dark, front steps empty. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, engine ticking, waiting for something to happen. My uniform soaked with sweat, the badge glinted hatefully in the rising sun. Finally, I turned off the ignition and climbed out. Bella greeted me eagerly, tail sweeping leaves and dust. I knelt to pat her and felt a tremor in my hand. Inside, I set my mug on the counter, the last drop of coffee pooling in the bottom. I glanced at the clock. 7:20. Sarah emerged in slippers, hair tied back, face bright. She offered me breakfast, a plate of eggs and toast, but I shook my head. I couldn't swallow food today. Instead, I placed a gentle kiss on her cheek. She sensed my distance but said nothing. I pressed into her for a moment, hoping to borrow her serenity before turning away. I headed upstairs to shower, water steaming around me while I washed away the sticky residue of night. I scrubbed at my arms, the uniform scars fading under the spray, but the things I carried couldn't be cleansed by water. They lingered in marrow, in dreams, in the shifting floor beneath my feet. I shivered as the chill of the room prickled my skin, and I realized I was shaking not from cold, but from memory. Dressed in fresh clothes, I retrieved the duffel from my car. Evidence staff would sort it, but the soul of its contents I kept with me. I slung it over my shoulder like a protest. As I descended the stairs, I noticed the calendar on the fridge. Today's date circled by Sarah with a bright red pen. Anniversary dinner, 7 p.m., a promise of normalcy. I paused, fingers brushing the circle, and felt a hollow ache. How do you live the mundane when nightmares stalk your every step? I left the house again at 8 a.m., duffel in tow, and drove to the station a final time. My shift officially ended at 6 p.m., but I carried the weight 24/7. I traded my cruiser for a parking spot, badge for ID card, locked uniformed duties away in the locker. I exchanged a tired nod with the clerk, grabbed the duffel, and headed for records. I needed to file one last report, a summary of the night's calls, as clinical as the binder demanded. Yet each line stood for a fragment of terror, a shard of something I couldn't put back together. At midday, the precinct corridors hummed with business as usual. Civilians filing complaints, detectives smoking cheap coffee, bailiffs shuffling papers. I approached my locker, unzipped the duffel, and withdrew the journal. I thumbed through those pages of scrawl, each entry a cry for help, a witness to madness. The manic handwriting looped and snapped, as if the pen danced beyond its writer's control. I traced my finger along one line. They stand behind me when I sleep. My breath caught. I realized then the final truth. It wasn't the calls that haunted me. It was the part of me that still heard silent words, saw shifting floors, waited for gravity to betray me again. The uniform and badge were shields, but the scars lay beneath skin, in the folds of the mind. I reassembled the journal in its duffel and locked the zipper. I hung the duffel on my locker hook and stepped back. No fat tears for the loss of innocence, just a quiet acceptance that some parts of the job become a permanent fixture. I closed the locker door with a soft click, the echo filling the empty corridor. I walked out of the precinct into midday sun, badge stowed in my pocket rather than worn. The world glistened around me. Traffic lights, pedestrians, an ice cream truck jingling down the street. Each sight felt hyper-real, as if the veil between nightmare and reality had thinned. I exhaled, chest tight. Above me, the sky stretched endlessly pale. I raised my eyes and saw, drifting among the white clouds, the outline of inverted chairs and tables, the nursery's ghosts suspended in bright daylight, refusing to settle back onto the floor. And I understood. There would be no end to these calls, no promise of sanity restored. Only the quiet, devastating realization that the true horror isn't what we encounter on midnight patrol. It's what we carry with us long after the shift ends. I turned off the siren before I crested the bridge over the Flint River, my cruiser's headlights cutting a pale swath through the thick night air. It was 10:13 p.m. on a Tuesday, and the world beyond that swirl of yellow light felt more like a painting than reality. Edges softened by humid haze, the low hum of cicadas undercut by distant frogs. I eased back on the throttle, letting the engine purr, and took a long swallow from my travel mug of coffee, now lukewarm, but still bitter enough to keep me alert. Dispatch had just sent me to a routine welfare check on Woodley Road, an unpaved ribbon lined with abandoned farmhouses and dilapidated barns. The caller said her neighbor's porch light had been out for days, and she hadn't seen him come or go. She worried about his health. I'd learned long ago that routine often meant nothing was routine. Still, I replayed the address in my head, 238 Woodley Road, pulling the cruiser onto the gravel shoulder and killing the engine. The only illumination came from the amber glow of a single street lamp, its bulb flickering as if refusing to stay alive. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the front gate, stepping carefully around a collapsed swing set whose metal chains groaned under a weight they no longer bore. The house, if you could call it that, was a sagging, single-story structure, its paint peeled back like sunburned skin. I knocked once, hard, on the warped wooden doorframe, and the house answered with a stifled creak. "Sheriff's office," I called through the crack. No response. I let the beam of my flashlight scan the porch. Peeling floorboards, a rocking chair swaying gently though no breeze stirred. The hush was absolute, except for the slow drip of water from a gutter spout onto the ground. I stepped inside, fishing for my radio. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mothballs and damp carpet. My flashlight beam danced across strewn papers and an overturned coffee table. Cups shattered on the floor. I whispered into the mic, "Be advised, I'm inside." No sign of movement. My voice sounded small in the high-ceilinged hallway. I followed a trail of muddy footprints toward the back door, pausing when the footprints stopped at the threshold. Outside, through the cracked glass, I saw the faint shape of a pickup truck, parked crookedly in the rear yard. A rusted grill leaned against its tailgate. I nudged the door open and slipped into the backyard. The truck's engine was cold, but the driver's door was open a crack. I clicked my flashlight over the seat. No one inside. Then I spotted footprints leading away into the tall grass toward an old corn crib. My pulse quickened. I crept forward, flashlight in one hand on the grip of my sidearm. The sky had clouded over, and the half-moon hid behind ragged clouds, making the world darker than before. Ahead, I heard a soft rustle. I switched off my flashlight and settled into silence. After a breath, I clicked it back on, empty field. But when I lowered the beam, I saw a single cornstalk bend as if someone had brushed past it. I called dispatch again. Possible subject fleeing on foot, West Field. My heart thudded in my chest. Within seconds, I heard another cruiser pull in behind mine, headlights spilling onto the dusty yard. I directed the other deputy to cover the south end while I advanced. We fanned out silently, the grass whispering against our boots. Then I saw him, a man hunched beside the old corn crib, shirt soaked through with sweat, face buried in his hands. I raised my voice. "Sir, hands where I can see them." He looked up, eyes red-rimmed, wild. I could almost taste the fear on the humid air. He stammered, I'm sorry, officer, I thought someone was out here." His voice cracked. I heard mumbling. I signaled the other deputy to stay back. Everything about this was off: the predicament, the crib, the man's frayed nerves. I holstered my weapon and approached, trying to seem calm. "Could be an animal, could be the wind. You okay?" He shook his head, muttering that he lived next door and heard his neighbor crying at night, crying for help. No one else had reported it, he said. Just him. I told the man to get back to his own property and called it in. Subject safe, claims auditory hallucinations. Back in the cruiser, I watched him stumble away under the grim glow of the street lamp. I couldn't help but glance at that corn crib where empty husks rustled, mocking the silence. Before I could process what I'd just seen, my radio crackled again. "Patrol to dispatch, go ahead. Traffic stop, Unit 45. Plate expired. Westbound on Highway 76, near the old train bridge." I stifled a groan. Shifting into gear, I punched my lights on and sped away. 10 minutes later, I rolled up behind a beat-up Honda sedan pulled to the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking intermittently. The road was narrow, lined by pines so tall they blocked out anything above the canopy. I killed the cruiser's lights and edged up behind the Honda. His window was down when I approached. The driver, a college-age kid in a faded hoodie, looked up, eyes bloodshot as though he'd been crying or up for days. He told me he'd been driving to visit his girlfriend in Beauregard, but nodded sheepishly when I mentioned the expired tags. I asked for his license and insurance, which he produced, shaking. I ran the info. No warrants. Tags registered to another vehicle long since junked. I explained the situation. He apologized, said he hadn't realized his registration lapsed. Then he asked if he could call his girlfriend to come pick him up. I hesitated. Something in his posture, slouched, desperate, didn't sit right. But I thought maybe it was just nerves. I stepped back to my cruiser to write a citation. The radio crackled with an unrelated priority call, so I turned away, pen in hand. When I glanced back, the Honda's door was open and the driver was gone. No footprints in the gravel. No sound except the wind rustling pine needles. I slammed my cruiser door and sprinted back, flashlight sweeping the tree line. Nothing. His phone still lay on the seat. I called it in. Subject absent upon my return. Plate and phone left in vehicle. Suspect unknown. Backup never arrived in time. I sat in the cruiser, coffee long since gone cold, staring at the empty seat. Behind me, that faint sound carried across the treetops, a soft rustle like anxious breath. My radio squawked again, another mundane call. A domestic disturbance at a trailer park on the edge of town. I slammed the cruiser into drive, heart pounding. As I tore back onto the highway, I replayed the night's events in my mind. A missing man who heard voices in the cornfield. A phantom driver who vanished under tall pines. And now, a fight in a rundown trailer park where people thought they could argue freely at 11 p.m. Routine calls, all of them. But tonight, each one felt like a doorway into something darker, something that might never let me close the door behind me. I glanced at the clock overhead, 11:47 p.m. The steady throb of my own pulse sounded louder than the engine. I flicked on my mic. Patrol to dispatch. Be advised I'm en route to the disturbance on County Line Road. If... I cut myself off, because even in the brief silence, I heard it. The soft clicking of marbles. Not in my car, not outside. Somewhere in the lull between calls, a sound I'd never heard before but could never unhear. And I knew, deep down, that this shift was far from over, and that I was running out of the margin between order and chaos. The gravel crunch under my tires faded as I turned off Highway 76 onto County Line Road, and the world narrowed to the dull glow of my dashboard and the dark silhouettes of single-wide trailers lined up like tombstones in a forgotten graveyard. The call had come in as a domestic disturbance. No shots fired, no weapons reported, but every officer knows that no weapons can change in an instant. I eased the cruiser past a flickering street lamp that cast long, wavering shadows across the road, then pulled up behind a dull green trailer with its door hanging open. I stepped out into the humid air and felt it press against my uniform like a damp blanket. The smell of stale smoke and something sour, old beer sour, hung heavy around the trailer. Inside, I saw two figures huddled in the doorway. A man in his late 30s, hands tucked in his waistband, and a woman crouched on the top step, arms wrapped around her knees, rocking slightly. When they spotted me, the man stiffened, and the woman looked up, her eyes wide, red-rimmed. She mumbled something I couldn't catch. I radioed dispatch, Unit 45 on scene. Stand by. I kept my hand loosely on my holster but didn't draw it. Instead, I spoke in a calm, steady voice. Evening. I got a call about a disturbance. Everything okay here? The man spat on the ground. She's crazy, he said, jerking a thumb toward the woman. Holds me hostage at night, talks to ghosts. His grin tasted like resentment. The woman shook her head and said, "He's lying." "I'm not." Her voice cracked, and she looked at me like a lost child. I asked them both separately what had happened. He said she'd been acting up since their kid died. Less than 2 months ago, a mattress jumper he called it, bouncing memories off the walls. She tearfully told me he came home drunk every night and called her names, blamed her for everything. No weapon, she said, but he stood too close, smelled of cheap whiskey. I felt the tension coalesce into something solid, something that could snap. I suggested he leave for the night, stay with a friend, sober up, and told her I'd walk him to my cruiser. He glared at me, but did as I said. Once he was in the back seat, I shut the door and turned back to her. She stood at the threshold, hands pressed to the peeling paint, breathing so shallow I could count the seconds. "Come on," I said softly. "Let's get you inside and somewhere safe." She nodded, but as we turned to enter, a sudden clatter echoed behind me. The man in the cruiser tapped the glass. "Officer, help," he said, wide-eyed. I sprinted back. The door was ajar, the back seat empty. The seatbelt buckle swung like a pendulum. No footprints outside. Nothing but the humming trailer and the cicadas. My heart thudded so loud, I was surprised the woman didn't hear it. I radioed for backup and drew my weapon. I told her to stay where she was, then moved in, every muscle coiled. The trailer's hallway was narrow, walls lined with peeling floral wallpaper, the overhead light flickering. I passed the living room. Sofa cushions torn, beer bottles strewn like fallen soldiers. Then the kitchen, where the sink overflowed with dirty dishes, roaches scuttling across the counter. My flashlight beam trembled as I moved down the hall toward 2 closed doors. I tried the first, locked, the second, ajar. I nudged it open and stepped into a bedroom choked with shadows. A dresser drawer was pulled shut with a thud, and on the floor lay a stuffed rabbit, its button eye missing. A low hum filled the room, like someone humming off-key just out of sight. I scanned the corners. Nothing. But then I heard it again, a soft rasping, breath against the dark. I called out, "Come on out." Silence, then the rattling of blinds behind me. I spun around, empty window. I dared a step closer to the bed and saw footprints in the thin carpet leading under the bed. I knelt and peered in, nothing but a handful of hairpins and a broken mirror shard reflecting the beam of my flashlight. No suspect, no man. The hum had stopped. Adrenaline surged, and I realized the woman's voice, soft, pleading, echoed behind me. I turned to see her standing in the doorway, pale as the moonlight seeping through the blinds. "He went that way," she whispered, pointing down the hall. I heard him walking. I signaled her to follow me out. Once both of us were back in the living room, I told her to lock the door behind us. Her hands shook so badly she dropped the key. I picked it up, clicked the bolt, and pocketed it. I motioned her to the cruiser, and we sat in stunned silence until backup arrived. They took her statement inside the station, and I remained outside with the now returned man who claimed he'd simply slipped out to cool off. I ran his name again through dispatch. No warrants, no priors. He lingered in my peripheral vision like a specter I couldn't dispel. By the time I cleared the call, the clock read 1:02 a.m. My coffee was cold, and the night felt endless. I drove away, listening to the radio chatter about a faint distress call from a gas station payphone. Caller hung up before disclosing details. I headed that way, aware that every routine call was a crucible, forging new scars I could never scrub away. As I neared the payphone, neon light from the station sign bled into the darkness, illuminating a figure hunched against the wall, trembling. The screen on my cruiser blinked. Dispatch confirmed, pending call. I killed the lights and approached, ready for another ghost in the night, another chapter of this endless confession I couldn't stop telling myself. I eased the cruiser out of the gas station's neon halo and peeled back onto the two-lane highway, the radio's static whispering alongside me. My mind still churned with the memory of the trembling figure huddled by that payphone. Cold, desperate, voice cutting off mid-sentence. I flicked on my high beams and settled into the rhythm of the road. Dark tarmac, yellow lines, the occasional headlight in the distance. It was 2:18 a.m. My shift had long since become a litany of half-answered calls and unanswered questions. 5 miles down, I passed the turnoff for Dawson's Ridge, a stretch of old logging road closed off by a rusty gate. Someone had reported headlights moving behind that barrier hours ago. They said the gate was locked, but the lights persisted, bobbing among the pines. Curiosity gnawed at me. I radioed in, "This is Unit 45. I'm investigating possible unauthorized vehicles on Dawson's Ridge. If I don't check back in 5 minutes, send another unit." My voice sounded hollow. I stopped at the gate. Muffled traffic from the highway faded to silence. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I slipped out and lifted the latch, knowing full well I was off duty for this, but unable to ignore the pull of the unknown. The gate swung open with a metallic groan. I clicked off my siren, leaving only the low hum of the cruiser's engine behind. The logging road was narrow, 2 tracks separated by a strip of grass. Moonlight filtered through the canopy in fractured shards. I advanced on foot, flashlight in one hand, radio in the other. About 100 yards in, I saw them. 2 sets of headlights parked side by side, pointed at the forest edge. I approached, each step echoing, and felt the hairs along my neck prickle. One vehicle was a beat-up Chevy Silverado, the other an unmarked white van with tinted windows. The Silverado's engine was off, but the van's tailpipe emitted a faint hiss. I trained my beam on the tailgate and found no one. Empty cab and bed. The van's side door slid open of its own accord, and at the threshold stood a lone man, his silhouette rigid, face hidden in shadow. He raised a hand in greeting. "Evening," he said, voice rough like gravel. "Officer." I kept the flashlight steady. "Sir, this area's closed. I'll need your IDs and reason for being out here." He stepped forward, and I caught sight of the sickly pallor of his skin, eyes glinting. He handed me a crumpled driver's license, but no explanation. Behind me, I heard a soft thud against the Silverado's door. I spun, flashlight illuminating the rear window. A woman's face pressed against the glass, wide-eyed, lips trembling, her hair matted. She mouthed something I couldn't discern. My heart hammered. I pointed my light at the van door. "Miss?" No answer. The man turned back to me. "She's fine, just scared." He smiled, and the beam caught the white of his teeth. "We're helping her. She needed to get away." I glanced at his ID, a small-town name I'd never heard. His story made no sense with a locked gate and no visible path deeper into the woods. I reached for my radio. "Dispatch? Suspect possibly detaining a juvenile female." He lunged at me, a blur of overheated desperation. I barely sidestepped, calling out, "Hey!" My flashlight dropped, beam skittering across the gravel. By the time I scooped it up, both vehicles were moving. The Silverado backing up, the van peeling off down the road. I sprinted after them, adrenaline burning in my limbs, but the pines swallowed their taillights within seconds. Panting, I radioed in a plate description, partial letters and numbers. Dispatch acknowledged and sent a patrol to set up a perimeter at the highway intersection. I returned to the gate, sweat clinging to my uniform, and searched the forest edge. No footprints, no tire tracks beyond the road. Just pine needles and the echo of that woman's plea. Shaking my head, I climbed back in the cruiser and slammed the door. The clock on the dash glowed 2:49 a.m. My coffee was long gone. The night air pressed in again as I drove toward the intersection, hands tight on the wheel, mind replaying the brief face in the Silverado's window. Whoever that woman was, she'd vanished like smoke, and my chest tightened with the guilt of leaving her. At the intersection, 2 deputies waited behind orange cones, their torches scanning headlights. We fanned out a lookout. Over the next half hour, no van, no Silverado. Just the distant hum of 18-wheelers barreling down the interstate. I radioed dispatch. Negative on plate hit, no sign of the pair, advising roving patrols. I stayed a few more minutes, then took off south on the highway, drawn by one final call logged for the night. A possible person trapped in a culvert under the old mill bridge, screaming for help. I telegraphed my ETA and found myself behind a lone sedan parked halfway on the bridge's wooden planks. Below, the river gurgled in darkness. I approached cautiously. The driver's window was down. No one inside. I clicked on my flashlight and peered over the edge. Water crystals sparkling in the beam, but no sign of movement. I peered into the culvert entrance, low and wide. A tunnel of corrugated metal disappearing under the road. From deep inside came an intermittent cry, a thin, ragged sound. "Hello? This is Sheriff's office. You need help?" My voice echoed off the metal walls. The crying stopped. A single whisper, "Please." I radioed for rescue and joined the deputies at the front. They lowered a spotlight into the tunnel, revealing slick walls and a wet floor 3 feet below. I tied off a rope and climbed down onto the platform of steel under the bridge, heart pounding in my ears. At the tunnel's lip, I crouched and called again. Silence, then a slight scuffling. I inched forward, flashlight beam broadening the tunnel's interior. Halfway in, I saw her. A teenage girl, soaked from waist down, arms wrapped around her knees. Dirt smeared her face. Tears glistened. Relief washed over me. "Ma'am, it's okay. I'm here to help." She looked at me, her eyes wide and hollow. "He left me. Said I needed punishment for disobedience." Her voice cracked like ice. "He locked me in here, almost died." I motioned the deputy to shine lights. At the tunnel entrance, a set of muddy footprints led back toward the bridge, disappearing into darkness. The girl gasped at the beam, her fear palpable. I radioed in. Subject definitely held against her will. Sending rescue and K-9 unit. We guided her up the rope ladder. Her legs trembled, and when she reached the deck, she collapsed into my arms. She smelled of river rot and fear. That smell stuck with me. We wrapped her in a thermal blanket and she whispered, "Why didn't anyone else come?" I tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "We did our best. You're safe now." Safe, but not whole. I stayed as rescue arrived, watching the K-9 unit comb the woods, flashlights dancing over the pines. The mouth of the culvert gaped like a wound in the earth. When they didn't find the man, I knew he'd melted into the night, waiting for another prey. At 4:07 a.m., I sat back in my cruiser, cradling an empty coffee cup, the dawn's first light staining the eastern sky. I radioed one final time. Unit 45 clear, returning to station. But inside, I felt anything but clear. The night had collected 3 lives in its shadows. The woman at Dawson's Ridge, the man and woman at the trailer, and the girl in the culvert, and left me with only fragments: a flashlight beam, a broken promise, footprints fading in mud. I rolled onto the highway and thought of home, silent, safe, sunlit, but I knew better. I knew the dark didn't end at dawn. It only paused to catch its breath, waiting for the next shift, the next call, the next officer who thought routine still meant safe. And as I drove, I realized the weight I carried wasn't just the uniform or the badge. It was the faces I couldn't leave behind, each one a whisper in the night I could never unhear. I eased the cruiser onto Highway 12, the first pale threads of dawn smearing the horizon. Sweat still clung to the back of my neck as I thought over the night's events, each call a bruise on my conscience. My radio crackled with a low-priority hang-up at the diner on Elm Street. I rolled to a stop beneath the neon "Open 24 Hours" sign, its red glow bleeding into the mist. Inside, booths stood empty except for a lone cook wiping down the counter. I stepped up. "This is Unit 45. Just following up on a hang-up call?" I slid my flashlight and badge into view. He shrugged, eyes tired. "Nobody," he said. Phone rang. I answered. It stopped cold, hung up. He tapped the phone. "Never saw anybody." I thanked him, filed it as "nothing found," but the silent booths felt too hollow. I left with a sense of being watched, though no one was there. Minutes later, dispatch sent me to a suspicious package at the community center. Someone had spotted an unmarked duffel bag on the playground slide. I flashed my lights in the empty lot and approached. The bag was heavy, bulging, unevenly, straps frayed. I crouched and unzipped half an inch. Inside, nothing except a stack of faded family photos. I snapped them out: birthdays, picnics, a toddler's toothless grin. Nothing sinister, but stapled to the top was a note in childlike scrawl: "I miss home." No name, no return address. I called it in as found property. Yet I couldn't move on. Those pictures were breadcrumbs leading nowhere. I pocketed the note and carried the photos back to my cruiser. When I flipped through them under the dome light, I noticed one face: an adult woman, dark hair, hollow eyes. She stared right back. I snapped the photo shut. The playground lights flickered off behind me, though I hadn't touched the switch. Later, at 3:12 a.m., I answered a citizen flag down on Blackhawk Road. A jogger claimed a dog was chasing him. I found him trembling, shirt soaked with sweat. He pointed into the shadows. A black Labrador sat 2 lanes over, growling low. I whistled. It lunged. I drew my taser, fired, hit, but the dog bounded off, disappearing into the underbrush. The jogger said, "That's not my dog." He looked angry. I radioed animal control, but by the time they arrived, no trace remained. No paw prints, no scent trail. Just an echo of barking that died as I approached. Section 5 has carried me from an empty diner to a haunted playground, from a phantom dog to an unanswered question. What ties these midnight fragments together? The road stretched ahead, dark and silent, and I realized the shift's weight would tip me if I didn't keep moving. I shut off the dome light, folded the photos into an evidence bag, and drove on, toward the next call, toward the slow burn of sunrise, toward whatever I'd unearth next. The road out of town was empty, except for my headlights cutting through the darkness as I drove toward the old St. Mary's Church on County Road 5. Another low-priority call, this one for a crying child, heard through the open doors after hours. The church sat alone beneath a canopy of oak trees whose branches reached out like skeletal arms. I parked on the cracked pavement and grabbed my flashlight, holstering my weapon but leaving my radio at the ready. The front doors were propped open, hinges creaking in the wind. Inside, the nave was bathed in shadow. Pews stood in neat rows, but the silence felt wrong, as if the building were holding its breath. I clicked my light over the altar, no sanctuary lamp, just moonlight filtering through stained glass, painting colored shards on the dusty floor. Then I heard it again, a soft wail, muffled behind the pulpit. I approached, heart pounding. The wail turned to sobbing. Beneath the pulpit, crouched against the cold stone, was a small boy, arms wrapped around his knees, tears glistening. He looked up, eyes wide with fear. "Sir, please," he whispered, "I can't find my mommy." His voice shook the stillness like a pebble dropped in a pond. I knelt beside him. "It's okay, you're safe. What's your name, buddy?" He sniffled. "Ethan." I swept my beam across the sanctuary, no one else. "Did you come here alone?" He nodded, trembling. I asked when his mother would return. He said she went to get supplies and never came back. I radioed dispatch for a child services unit and backup. While I comforted Ethan, I noticed the hymnals strewn on the floor, pages torn and fluttering. A brass offering plate lay overturned, coins scattered like dead leaves. I flicked my light toward the choir loft stairs and saw muddy footprints, small, barefoot, leading up. My pulse spiked. "Ethan, can you hear Mommy crying upstairs?" He shook his head. I signaled to the other deputy as he arrived, and we ascended the narrow stairs, flashlight beams dancing over peeling paint. In the loft, we found nothing but empty benches and a broken electric organ whose keys were frozen in mid-chord. A single hymn book lay open on a stand, page turned to "Abide with Me." The silence pressed in, suffocating. Back in the nave, Ethan was gone. I yelled his name. My radio buzzed with my own voice echoing. I raced down the center aisle, no sign of him. The front doors swung shut behind me with a slam that reverberated like a gunshot. I threw the doors open and shone my light around the perimeter. No footprints in the grass, no sound except the wind rustling the oak leaves. I called it in. Juvenile missing. Last seen in St. Mary's Church. No sign of struggle. We searched the church grounds with flashlights. Then my canine partner arrived. The dog nosed at the threshold, then bolted into the woods along a deer path. I followed, heart in my throat, until the dog stopped at a shallow depression beside a creek bed. No Ethan, no footprints, just the faint hum of insects in the water. Defeated, I returned to the cruiser and tried to process how a child could vanish without a trace. The night was nearing its end, 3:56 a.m. I sent out an alert for any sightings, then drove back toward town. Almost in town limits, my radio crackled. Officer down. Priority on Pine Street. I hit the lights and screeched around the corner to find one of our newest officers lying on the sidewalk, his cruiser door open, head cradled in his hands. He looked dazed, sweaty, and when he saw me, relief washed over his face. "I don't know what happened," he said, voice hoarse. "I responded to a burglary in progress, but I came around the corner and there was no house, just an empty lot. Then a voice telling me to lay down. and I felt something pressing on my chest. My blood ran cold. We helped him into the cruiser while I called EMS. He kept repeating, "It was so real, like someone was standing over me." I radioed dispatch to check if any calls had been made from that lot. Nothing. A week ago, a house there burned. The lot had been cleared, foundations removed. Yet, he'd seen walls, a front door, and a flashlight beam that wasn't his own. By 4:45 a.m., EMS had taken him away, and we learned he'd suffered a panic attack with physical symptoms. I drove off in silence, the weight of the shift settling on my shoulders like a wet blanket. Only one call remained, logged as unknown disturbance near the railroad crossing at the edge of town. I rolled into my last beat, coffee mug empty, dawn's promise on the horizon. At 5:12 a.m., I found the crossing gates down, lights flashing but no train in sight. Beyond the gate, on the tracks, stood a lone figure in uniform, the outline unmistakable, a police officer. My heart froze as I flicked on my siren and jumped out. The figure raised its head. My own face stared back, hollow-eyed, mouth open in a silent scream. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the grinding of steel on steel and my own voice echoing from that empty tracks. "Help! Me!" I jolted awake to fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell. My uniform gone, replaced by a stiff hospital gown. My head throbbed in time with the beep of a heart monitor. I tried to sit up, and pain flared across my shoulder, where I must have fallen. A nurse hovered, eyes soft but urgent. "Take it easy, Sheriff. You were out cold for 6 hours." 6 hours. The world outside my window was washed in late morning sun, birdsong drifting through the cracked open blinds. I closed my eyes against the brightness and let the nurse adjust my IV. When I opened them again, the door cracked, and the sergeant stepped in, face grim. He handed me a paper-clipped stack, incident reports, witness statements, lab analyses. "No bodies found at any of the scenes," he said. "No CCTV of the van or Silverado. No prints in the culvert. The marbles from the farmhouse were traced back to a charity donation site. No missing items. And the girl from the church. She was never registered as a child in this county. Her DNA came back inconclusive." I stared at the notes, each one a blank intersection where reality fell away. "And me?" I rasped. "Did I hallucinate that face on the tracks?" The sergeant shook his head. "All you." A moment of silence stretched between us, long enough for the sunbeam to shift on the floor. Outside, I heard a cart wheel by and someone calling for breakfast trays. I swallowed against a dry mouth. "I don't remember hitting my head," I said, "just seeing my own face, screaming under that gate." The sergeant nodded. "You're cleared for release, but I'd recommend desk duty for a while, and get some sleep." He left, closing the door with a soft click that echoed louder than any brass knuckles. My heart pounded in the empty room, remembering the chill of that apparition's eyes. I turned my head, catching my reflection in the window glass. Pale, hollow, uniform replaced by hospital blues. I rose unsteadily and padded to the window. Below, the parking lot was empty. I pressed my palm to the glass, feeling the cool barrier between me and the world I once patrolled. No footprints, no cars, no sign that any of it had been real, except for my scars and the knot in my gut. They'll say it was concussion, sleep deprivation, stress. They'll chalk it up to fatigue and chalk me up to time off. But I know what I saw. I know the shift never ends just because the sun comes up. I closed my eyes and let memories wash over me. Marbles rolling, the girl's tear-streaked face, that broken mirror reflecting me screaming on the tracks. And as I stood there, I realized the hardest truth. I'm not the one making these calls anymore. It's them calling me, at the back porch, shotgun in hand, wearing helplessness like armor. I slipped through the gate and crossed the short yard, crunching over broken glass and scattered debris. I pulled my flashlight and gun from the shoulder holster, weapon light tearing through the darkness. This time, I wasn't searching for a suspect. I was searching for closure. I needed to see a life left behind to believe someone could survive a barricade without shattering completely. Inside, the door creaked on swollen hinges. I swept the light across tattered curtains, across a collapsed sofa cushion that lay in the hearth like a fallen leaf. I traced splintered floorboards to the staircase. My light danced along the railing, posts of chipped wood where generations had leaned to peer over the edge. I climbed slowly, boots whispering on the steps, each one a greeting to ghosts no longer tethered to the world. At the top, the hallway stretched in both directions, doors closed like clenched fists. I followed to the left, toward the master bedroom. The door was ajar, pale moonlight spilled in from a window overhead, illuminating a dust-coated dresser. I entered quietly. Furniture lay askew, a vanity mirror cracked in a spider pattern. A single shoe perched on the floor, red, small, battered. I crouched beside it. No name etched inside, no note tucked between laces. Just a remnant of someone who'd once worn it. I rose and moved to the window. The pane was intact but smeared with grime. I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling the cold seep into my gloves. The ground below was a blur of shadows. I imagined a woman there, waiting, rifle trembling in her grip. I pictured her listening to the wind. The same wind I heard now, wondering whether any rescue was coming. A door at the far end clicked. My hand tightened on the flashlight, barrel of the shotgun yawning beneath the beam. My training kicked in, distance, cover, threat assessment. But my brain fought each response, flooding me with memories of her face, hollow with despair and resignation. I lowered the gun, no threat, only the house settling into the night. I swept the light back across the room. On the desk, I saw pages scattered, journal entries, torn in half, words jagged like broken bones. I stepped forward and gathered them. In neat cursive, they promised safety. Another page, I believed them, and another, the badge felt like a lie. My chest tightened. She'd written that, I realized. She'd penned her own breakdown in ink that had dried too quickly. I stacked the papers and slipped them into my coat pocket. My mind raced. Evidence that could change the story printed in the paper, in the report I'd filed. But I wasn't thinking of procedure, I was simply thinking of her voice, strong even in broken sentences. The house exhaled around me, groaning like an old man's last breath. I turned toward the door and paused. A shaft of moonlight caught something on the floor by the dresser, a locket. I knelt, pried it open, and saw a faded photo inside. 2 women, arms entwined, smiling as they sat by a park bench. Identical faces, identical smiles. Sisters, friends, partners. The caption scratched inside read, "Always together." I closed it gently and slipped it into my other pocket. I retraced my steps and left the bedroom. The house was still and patient, waiting for the next visitor. At the staircase, I paused, one hand on the railing, and let the silence fill me. I felt hollowed out, as though I'd given pieces away in exchange for answers I could never fully have. I thought of the phrase I'd resisted writing in the report. She was broken. Now I realized that some things break from the inside out. Outside, I exhaled and let the night air wash over me. I walked back to the river park and sat once more on the bench overlooking the water. I deposited the locket and papers beside me, everything she'd left behind now scattered in moonlight. I waited, listening to the river's endless song, waiting for a sign that I'd done enough. Dawn came too slowly, a pale promise on the horizon. I rose, shoulders heavy, and walked away without looking back. The locket and pages remained behind, caught in the current of my mind and the current of the river. Impossible to retrieve once released. And I realized the only person I couldn't save was myself.